All right, we're live here with my Twitter follower who reached out to me and wanted to talk about politics. And I thought, well, since this weekend there's a lot of Twitter battles about the Clinton versus Sanders factions about the primaries, I thought we'd have a discussion about that and sort of the larger sort of political debates around that area. And so, welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I've been following you for a little while. I'm actually quite a fan, Alex. I must say, of your output. I like your videos on Dave Rubin. But like, what really struck me after I started following you on Twitter was that you seem very knowledgeable about American politics in general, but also in particular Democratic politics. And I've wanted to have kind of an in-depth conversation about the Democratic Party for a
Yeah,
while. And
yeah.
so, I mean, I think you're a good guy to do it with because you really seem to know your stuff and you seem very engaged with it.
I know a lot. I know a lot. I think. I mean, probably more than I should, but I find it interesting. So, it's sort of my version of sports, in addition
Right.
to
Yeah.
actual sports.
Yeah.
But
That's how I find it.
yeah. But you're actually from Canada, so it's completely a spectator sport for you.
It is. Yeah. And I actually find that when I follow American politics, it is more of a spectator sport in the sense that it doesn't rile me like when I follow Canadian politics. Like, I can only imagine how I would feel as an American with like Trump as president and like the whole country, like,
Oh, it's
yeah, going down. No, I mean, like, I get mad about like Trudeau's, budgets, like I just can't imagine like I get to watch it as a spectator in the US, but it must be a very different experience.
yeah. Well, I don't know if you know the comedian Norm Macdonald.
I don't unfor I know the name. I know the name.
Well, he's from Canada. And he's this whole bit about explaining like in Canada the politics is just sort of like, should we build the bridge?
Yeah, it's more like that. Yeah, exactly.
When America, we're discussing destroying the entire world, and apparently we're
Well,
currently in the
yeah,
process of it. So
foreign policy certainly really isn't even a big part of the conversation at all in Canada. It's like, should we have our jets be part of the air coalition against ISIS? I don't know. Like, will adding a few more jets make much of a difference anyway? It's not. There aren't these big geopolitical questions when it comes to Canada.
right. And so originally, I said you were a Sanders supporter, and like apparently you're not exactly in that camp. Like certainly
Yeah.
you're not like an orthodox Sanders Bernie.
No, I guess I'll elaborate a little bit on my position there. Well, for starters, I don't identify as a Sanders supporter because I think the Sanders Clinton binary view of politics that's sort of developed is one, outdated, and two, just a really oversimplified, bad way to understand politics.
I agree. I agree.
I Yeah, I look, okay, I guess I'll step back a little bit. During the primary itself, I was following it pretty closely, and I kind of went back and forth a lot between Clinton and Sanders. I liked Sanders' passion on a few issues. That was what really kind of drew me to him originally, but after the first debate, I thought he gave a really poor performance. And I started then, kind of reconsidering Clinton. I thought she was smarter, regardless of where I stood on her policies. And she was giving some good answers to things. And so I eventually sort of just became indifferent to it all. I just wanted somebody to beat Trump or Cruz, really.
Mhm.
And I think, though, if I was back in the primary season now, as like with my views in 2017, I probably would be a Sanders supporter more consistently because at the time I was a bit of a neoconservative, so I actually liked Clinton's hawkishness. Whereas now, my views of foreign policy in general, but then also in some narrow areas like say Syria or whatever, have evolved, and I'm now more like Sanders. So I guess I'm a Sanders supporter in that sense, but I don't really consider myself part of that camp, and I'm not a huge fan of a lot of his most ardent supporters.
Yeah, a lot of the people on Twitter who are Sanders supporters are real goofballs. I mean, I have a lot of friends who support Sanders and are totally normal. So it's not like I think a lot of the people who are on Twitter who support any candidate, they tend to be the people who like bark the loudest. Don't
Yeah,
say
exactly.
a lot of those. I mean, there's a lot of people who support Clinton or who are Democrats, and they say stuff on Twitter, and you're just like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, like Peter Dayu is one of the worst examples that comes to mind. That guy, he needs some help.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I
didn't
don't
he
follow his Twitter, but I think you see a lot of these people, and maybe they don't necessarily put off their best self on Twitter. I don't necessarily do that myself all the time.
Just to use Peter Dayu as an example, yeah, on Twitter he says some really ridiculous things. He conflated Nazis with Democrats supporting the white working class, which I thought was just absolutely insane and insulting. Like, he says that kind of crazy stuff on Twitter, but he had an appearance on Tucker Carlson where I thought he actually performed way better than I expected him to based on his Twitter presence. Maybe he was probably on his best behavior for national TV, but yeah, some people are very different online. I don't know what it is really. Like, maybe it's the fact that there's not like immediate human presence that alters our behavior a little bit. But yeah, people can be very different on Twitter, especially, than they are in real life.
Not Jill Stein supporters though.
Oh yeah, they're annoying.
I live in Brooklyn. That's where the Clinton campaign office is in downtown Brooklyn, or was in downtown Brooklyn.
Right.
So I was walking through downtown Brooklyn one day, and I walked past the Clinton office, and they were having a Jill Stein protest outside. And so I talked to a few of them, and they were like just the worst. They were so mean to me just because they knew I wasn't a Jill Stein supporter talking to them. It was amazing.
Yeah, they're tied with Trump supporters for being my least favorite political actors, especially in 2016. Honestly, I just find them sure, I probably agree with them on a lot of things. Like, I think you probably do too, whether it's like the environment or whatnot. But they're just so belligerent and they spread so much misinformation. That's what really gets me, and that's where I really take issue with some of these people like Nina Turner and what's her name, like Roseanne DeMaio. Like, they push so much misinformation. That's just the one thing I really can't stand.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, those two people, like, the worst are the Jimmy Dore type people.
Oh God, don't. Oh, Jimmy Dore is just awful.
The people who are talking like Seth Rich and
oh God,
that to me, that's the level of Bernie bro. That's the best. That's like the pinnacle of being an awful Bernie bro, is being a Seth Rich truther.
And like, for me,
the DNC lawsuit that just got dismissed in Florida.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was Secular Talk, who I sometimes like and sometimes don't, or if it was somebody else, but like maybe he retweeted it. Like, somebody was like, this is insane. The judge said that Desi Wasserman Schultz was biased, but he's dismissing the lawsuit for fraud. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's a difference between her being biased and actual like hard rigging and fraud taking place. Like, how is that not something people can understand? I've tried to explain that at length.
Well, that was kind of an interesting situation, and a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters totally misrepresented that dismissal of the lawsuit. I guess I just want to mention this, but
sure, it's relevant to this. Definitely,
at the summary judgment stage, or of a civil litigation, the standard of review for the judge is, if you assume all the factual allegations of the plaintiff are true, do they have a case? If you assume all the facts are true. So if they allege something that's not a crime, like, I allege that you wore a bow tie on last Sunday, that's not a crime, or that's not. There's no liability for that. So
yeah, Bill Nye and Tucker Carlson would be in jail long ago.
Exactly. So if there's no if you assume the facts that are alleged in the complaint are true, is there any kind of a case? And what the judge looked at was, actually, if you go back in history, go back to the 1950s, they didn't even have primary elections. It was just the party leaders, the party elites in every different state decided on the candidate at the convention. So it's not, there's no duty from the DNC to even have primaries. And they don't actually run the vast majority of the primaries. So it's really, it was a ridiculous lawsuit to begin with. And the lawyer who brought it was a Pizzagate believer. He was completely bonkers guy. So
Pizzagate? I knew he was into the Seth Rich stuff, but I didn't know about Pizzagate.
I got into a Twitter fight with this guy, and he accused me of being like a DNC assassin.
Oh God.
I mean, I think he has mental problems of some sort, or he seems to. You would think that he does based on his Twitter presence.
I don't know why more people can't basically just adopt my position on this whole DNC thing. Debbie Wasserman Schultz was biased. She resigned, as she should have done earlier, but that still doesn't mean that the election was rigged. And it certainly doesn't mean that it was rigged to an extent that barred Sanders from otherwise winning, which is what people often insinuate.
Well, okay. I have to respond to that point you just made.
Okay.
Because, for one thing, let's say, theoretically, that the DNC chairman supported Clinton. That by itself is not being biased, right?
Like they personally are going to vote for Clinton in their local primary.
Right.
Sure. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
And because the DNC chairman is selected by the sitting president, of course they're probably going to have a bias towards the establishment candidate every single time, right? Every single time they're going to support the mainstream person over the outsider. Like, and that's kind of makes sense. But the DNC does not administrate the process, for the most part, in my opinion, because most of the process happens. It's the voters deciding. It's the media. It's these cable news. It's social media. The things that determine how the election go. It's not the DNC making the decisions. They schedule debates. That's one thing they do. But
yeah,
aside from that, they don't really have much impact on the election. The DNC, they spend money on beating Republicans. They don't even spend their money until the general election comes around. Really, I mean, they're registering voters. They're helping Democrats, but they didn't spend money to help Hillary Clinton. They didn't really do anything to help her.
I agree with everything you just said, but I think what gives people what made people concerned, I think rightfully, although they often extrapolated from this in ridiculous ways, was that DNC. I don't recall their names. Sorry, it's such a detail, but I don't recall their names. But they were like, weren't they? They were like sending emails about like, oh, how can we use should we try to use like Sanders's Jewish atheism against him or whatever? No, that was above and beyond, really.
All of those
clearly
emails,
above and beyond what they should have been doing.
Well, all the emails that people look at were sent in May or June, and the election had already been decided. And I think they were just like people sort of being snippy and speculating about arguments that could be made by them, by
surrogates, like Clinton surrogates, right?
Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or
but I don't think. Yeah,
the DNC does not have this magical ability to force people to believe things or
I know, but they can influence. They have influence.
Not really. I mean, if you ask,
no, but they can have influence over individuals. Now, not in a huge concrete way, but they can exert influence in various ways, even if it's in rather arcane kind of little ways.
But I think a lot of people overestimate how powerful the DNC is, and
I don't dispute that. But just when the DNC are supposed to be kind of a non-partial, administrators of say something like a primary season, when they clearly showed, it clearly showed that some very high-ranking individuals were kind of speculating about how they could hurt one candidate. From what I think, they were saying oh, I wonder if Chuck Schumer is going to bring up Bernie's atheism. It was can we use this against him? And no, I think that was a pretty clear example of
I don't think
bias there.
I don't think I don't think they said let's use DNC resources to spread this idea, or let's call up reporters and pitch them this story.
They didn't say that specifically, but I mean, it was left fairly open-ended, and it was just territory that they, as neutral arbiters, they just shouldn't have gone into. Can we agree on that?
Well, of course, they shouldn't have sent the emails, but if you're a Democrat and you're, you work for the party, and one side is attacking you, and one side is claiming that you're not being fair, and they're basically using you as an example of this awful group of establishment Democrats. And the primary is already over. We already know that Hillary's going to be the nominee. They were ticked off at Bernie Sanders. They were like, "Why aren't you getting out of the race? You're annoying. You're making up bullshit. I don't like you." And those are just people who work at the DNC, and they're like, "This guy's annoying. I don't like him." So
I understand the frustration. I wanted him to either drop out or not ramp up the attacks on Clinton that late in the race, because I thought it was pointless and divisive at that point. That's what I was thinking at the time, and that's what I still think. But I mean, I just think that's, even though there's no evidence they did anything to act on that idea of using his religion against him, it was territory that, as neutral arbiters, they should have steered clear from, and it was only right and transparent if they just steer clear from there. It undermined a lot of faith that got out.
Well, I mean, also they didn't know they were going to be hacked by Russia, so
that's true. Yeah, they didn't know this was going to get out, but still, they shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have been doing it anyway. I mean, Russia. Look, I'm not one of those people. I think it's bad, but like, Russia did expose something that actually happened, and people, I think, are right, like myself included, to take issue with what was said. Now, obviously,
do you think if we looked at the Bernie Sanders campaign, or
I don't doubt it. No, there would be lots of terrible stuff about Hillary, terrible things about Hillary Clinton and the Sanders emails that are totally inappropriate. I have no doubt in my mind, but that doesn't make it.
Let's use Yeah, I mean, but these are personal emails going between people who work in an office, who aren't going to then use their preference for Hillary Clinton to do anything. And if they tried to, it would be so obvious that they were, breaking faith with fairness. It would actually help Bernie Sanders, because if you actually remember, the Sanders campaign illegally accessed data from the Clinton campaign.
I just want to bring up one point here. And when it comes to things about the Sanders campaign, I don't doubt there's all kinds of, funny business, but as there usually is in politics. But you're kind of talking about the Sanders campaign in a way that is sort of suggesting a conflation between the DNC and the Clinton campaign. Like, the DNC isn't a partisan campaign for one candidate that gets to do whatever they want, and ads, all that advocates for Canada. They are supposed to be a neutral arbiter that isn't even supposed to really go into that territory. They're supposed to make sure the primary runs in a fair way. It's not their job to, behave like a campaign in a primary contest.
Right. I mean, I don't disagree, but to just sort of look at personal emails of people and their personal opinions and say that's unfairness, to me, it's, especially when, if you looked at every single person's personal emails, you would find a lot of snippy, mean things they've said that would be very stupid to release publicly and would be unfair to release publicly. And they would show, the person's personal views that they shouldn't publicly announce. And they didn't publicly announce them. They were stolen. So it's saying that that's an example of their bias.
Yeah, well, it's not just bias. It's that they did say what they said about his religion did sound like it. There was some.
It's not a dumb thing to say.
Possibility, but there was in what they said some possibility of intent to act on it. Like, even though there's no evidence they did act on it, there was some there was the clear they were suggesting a possibility of acting on it somehow. But in those emails, which is just, I know, like, it undermines faith, and that they just shouldn't have done it.
Let's say a DNC staffer in June 1st says, Bernie Sanders is not going to do very well in the general election because he's a non-practicing Jew and he's basically an atheist.
Yeah, sure, but
would that help Hillary Clinton? No.
Would them saying that help her? No, but the problem is when they brought up his atheism, it was in a context of, if we look at the email, I think we could look it up. It says, can we do something with this? Or it's something along those lines, like something indicating some kind of, they're toying with the desire of trying to use his religion against him.
Yeah, but they as the DNC don't just saying those words is not they're not going to spend money to put up ads about it. They don't
Like I
have
said,
they don't have the ability to make that into like a social media sensation of people being like, oh my God, Bernie
yeah,
Sanders is an atheist. That's not good.
I
So,
I agree. I agree with that.
so focusing on that as an example of unfairness, I don't. To me, it's such a non-issue really.
All
But
right. Well,
but let's sort of go forward to sort of our
exactly. Yeah. We've been talking about this going around for a little while.
right. So it seems to me that what's happening this weekend with the Bernie Sanders people is that they've been attacking the idea of closed primaries. So that's a primary where only members of the Democratic Party, people who are registered Democrats, can vote in the primary. Versus an open primary, which is either independents can vote or independents and Republicans can vote in, which they can only vote in one per year, but they can pick which primary they want to vote in.
Oh, so they can't vote in both. So you do have to pick one.
Right.
Okay.
So the Sanders people want open primaries, but and they're saying that the closed primaries are unfair because people who are independents can't vote, and it's voter suppression, and it's a bad idea in all these ways. And Clinton supporters are saying, well, actually, we don't want Republicans or people who are not Democrats voting in our process. And the caucus system is actually much more anti-democratic because when you have a caucus, you have much lower turnout. They tend to be attended by the people who are activists, and a lot of people are shut out, like disabled people, old people, people who are working during the caucus can't attend, obviously. And the caucuses, basically, they amplify the votes of a few people in a few states, and the states that happen to have caucuses are these lily white states that supported Bernie Sanders, and it's pretty convenient that the Bernie Sanders people have absolutely no problem with this undemocratic system that helped them a lot.
Isn't the issue with the caucuses that really exposes how they lend themselves to somebody like Sanders, less the fact that like they happen specifically in like these white kind of ruralish states, and more the fact that they do happen in some other states, and regardless of demographics of the state as a whole, Sanders just always won them. Isn't that kind of the issue? Like that shows the specific issue with caucuses with respect to like how they would favor one kind of candidate over another. Like there are caucuses in more diverse states, and Sanders won them all, even if they were states that otherwise you'd think would definitely go to Clinton.
Well, that's not quite true because she did win the caucus in Iowa and the caucus.
Oh, right. She won that by like a little bit, right? The Iowa one was pretty close.
Yeah, she won that by, I don't know, it was like 2 delegates or something.
Yeah, it was really close. But yeah, you could say like, is Hawaii a primary or a caucus?
Hawaii is a caucus, and
right, and Hawaii is pretty diverse, but it's not like African Americans and Hispanics though. It's
majority Asian.
So, yeah, exactly. I don't know.
I don't know the demographics of the caucus per se, but a lot of what happens is that if you look at states that are have pretty equal demographics, like you look at North Dakota has a caucus, Bernie Sanders won 2-1, and South Dakota has a primary, Hillary Clinton barely won. So you can't just it does amplify his advantage wherever it is.
Yeah. Inherently, yeah. It's not just like this. What I'm pointing out, and maybe this is just more articulate way to put it. It's not you kind of let in with like these caucuses are in like these lily white states that Sanders wins, but I think the point is more that caucuses lend themselves to Bernie Sanders seemingly regardless of what state they're in. Regardless of how they would otherwise go. Like you just used a good example of the 2 Dakotas, very similar states demographically. Yet Sanders does really well in one because there's a caucus, and Clinton does, better in the other with a primary.
Right. Well, I think it's a little bit of both because it does amplify his advantage, and it allows a few voters, a lower number of voters to get a higher percent, like higher delegates per person. So, there's 26,000 people voted for Sanders in Kansas. He got like 23 delegates from that. And Clinton got 23 delegates from 147,000 people voting in Arkansas. So,
well,
there is an aspect to it where these few states that have them are amplifying, the influence of a few people in their state that are of the demographics of their state. But I think that you're right about the bigger aspect of it. It's that the people who are really enthusiastic activists tend to have more say in caucuses.
Yeah, and it's also young people. It's young people that have more free time, and it's generally people that are a little wealthier and can, or have a better job where they can take time off work. It does tend to skew it that way.
Yeah, I mean, Barack Obama won all these caucuses too, and it tends to be the candidate who's more anti-establishment,
more exciting,
more left wing, and has more of, their campaign is a movement, right? The Obama campaign was a movement of people, and it's almost like, the Sanders campaign and the Obama campaign. On one hand you call them a movement, on the other hand you call them a cult, right? It's people are super energized and they care about something like it's life and death.
Right. I think before we talk about caucuses more, I think you and I have at least a cursory understanding of them. You know a lot about the caucus system. A lot of people are very confused by what these caucuses even are. Why don't you take some time to explain some caucuses, and then we should talk a bit about the context under which all of this is happening, like, the discussion of primaries, caucuses, the Unity Commission, all that. Let's lay out that groundwork right now.
Right. So I guess first you have to understand what a primary is. A primary is just a regular election. You go into your polling place, which there's a ton of polling places, like the local school near your house is probably a polling place. You go in there, you sign your name to the poll book, they give you a ballot, you bubble in what candidate you're going to vote for, you hand them the ballot, and they put it in the counting machine. That's it, right? That's pretty easy. Or if you have like the old, polling booth where you pull a lever, whatever. So in a caucus, instead what you do is you go there, you sign your name, and they have some way of counting who supports each candidate. So who's an O'Malley supporter, who's a Clinton supporter, who's a Sanders supporter. And then they have this thing where it's like, okay, the candidates need to have 15% viability. And they divide everyone up and they say, okay, there's 50 Clinton supporters, 100 Sanders supporters, and 5 O'Malley supporters. So O'Malley is not viable. He has to. Those people have to decide where they're going to go, who's their second choice, and then you look at, okay, Clinton has 52, Sanders has 3. Now let's apportion how many delegates go to each person, and people run in their subgroup for promotion to the next round of caucuses. So you have a caucus in your local area. There's a caucus in your congressional district, a caucus in your state, and the caucus in your state votes on people to go to the national convention. So it's the one thing is that there's a lot fewer caucuses. So, it's not going to be at your local school. It's going to be maybe at your local high school for your city, or it's going to be, there's a lot fewer of them. And it's a sort of chaotic thing where there's people are giving speeches, people are trying to negotiate how many delegates do you get.
It's like a mini convention. It's like
it's like a little political convention. And partially also you're not just deciding, okay, this candidate gets 115 votes, this candidate gets 114 votes. It's Hillary gets 5 delegates, Bernie gets 10 delegates. That's the result of the caucus. You're electing among yourselves people, and there can be remainders, and you're doing math on the fly if you're a campaign. If you have a representative of your campaign in the caucus room, you're telling your voters, okay, you go to this group, you go to that group, so that the numbers will balance out, so we'll get more delegates. So it's an insider game, right? And the people who sort of know the math better, tend to actually get more delegates. That's why, in 2008 in Iowa, the John Edwards campaign was really smart about delegates because they had run 4 years before. So they actually got a lot more delegates per vote than all the other campaigns because they were so smart. So it's one of those things where, it's sort of viewed as this kind of kooky, fun thing, but it's actually kind of, a nightmare for a lot of people who don't want to deal with the mishigas and the, debating with their friends and, sitting in a room for 2 hours, maybe deciding who gets to be a delegate.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental issue with caucuses with respect to voter turnout, which in a democracy theoretically you want more of, is that they're just so time and energy consuming, and also there's fewer places where they're held in a state, and it just really, you can look at the numbers. The voter turnout is much lower in caucuses than it is in primaries, and that's largely because it's just easier to participate in a primary.
Right. Well, I think they have their place in terms of, if you're deciding on who the people should be to be your local Democratic representatives, and you want to have a meeting, it's fine for what it is, but it shouldn't be the method to determine who is president of the United States. Democracy, one man, one vote, one woman, one vote. Let's just count them up. Whoever has a majority should win. It's not like the candidate whose supporters are the most insanely passionate should win. It should be, okay, who has more votes? It shouldn't be like, let's do an applause meter. Who's more willing to scream their ass off for their candidate?
Yeah, and it does have a bias towards, I'm a young person. I don't hate young people, but it does. The caucuses do, in terms of they get out, skew more towards people who are young, people who are energized and excited for a candidate, and people who have the free time to do so. That they are simply just more time consuming than a primary generally.
Oh, I mean, well, think about it. Like, let's say you're an immigrant, or you're somebody who moved to this country 20 years ago. You're a citizen, but you don't speak perfect English. And you're thinking of, I'm going to go to this place where people are debating and fighting with each other. I'm not. You might not want to do that. Or if you're disabled or you're 95 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you're just shy, if you're like a major introvert, it's not going to be your place.
Yeah, and then there's another thing. Let's say the caucus is at 7 p.m. and your shift is at work is 6 p.m. to midnight. You can't go.
Yeah, whereas primaries are typically all day long, correct?
Right. Or you can have absentee balloting or mail-in votes, so everyone can vote, whether they have mobility issues or whatever. So to me, it's not something that we should be using to determine the presidential candidates, because when we talk about these as if it's like the party decides who their candidate is, but that's not really what it should be. It should be, let's just, as a nation, we should be the two people who have the most support in the country should get, the ability to be the candidates. It's not just, it shouldn't be a backroom thing of activists deciding.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
Else.
And so I think we're mostly in agreement when it comes to caucuses being a bad way to determine who the nominee is going to be. I get they look fun. I would probably really like going to a caucus if I was living in, a state that had a caucus. But it's just not a fair democratic way to do these things. And I think we're pretty much in total agreement on this. But I think people want to know, if they aren't really following this stuff, the context under which this discussion is being had. So back in the summer of 2016, around the time of the Democratic National Convention, don't know the specific date, you might, but they formed the Democratic Unity Commission. Basically various different Democratic figures and influencers from the Sanders and Clinton camp to basically discuss, how to form better unity in the party, but also how to reform the primary system, which had been highly controversial. And so they got a bunch of people together, some of which I think are fine choices. Other ones, like Nina Turner, I'm not a huge fan of. But one of them recently, Namiki Konst, who sits on it, she was a Clinton supporter turned Sanders supporter, I believe, who was a kind of a Democratic activist, who is also a contributor to the Young Turks. She's kind of like a political Renaissance woman, I guess. She does like a ton of stuff, but she's taking heat recently for allegedly, although I think it's becoming increasingly clear. I haven't really followed all the specifics, that she is pushing to have primaries replaced by caucuses by 2020. Is that the case?
I don't think that's true.
I thought you were talking about that on Twitter.
Okay, here's what I think that she is trying to do. I think if the Sanders campaign could have what they wanted, they would say there are certain states that have closed primaries. I think what she wants is for the DNC to tell those states, okay, you can have a closed primary, but we're going to deduct 20% of your delegates if you have a closed primary.
Oh, so she's like wants to heavily incentivize open primaries. Okay, I thought she was trying to encourage a switch to caucuses, but I guess I've heard about the open primaries too.
Right. I think that would be their position in regards to but to me, to penalize any state or to penalize closed primaries, which you can argue whether they're problematic or not. I can see both sides of the argument. I'm not super in favor of closed primaries. I don't care that much. I don't think it matters a whole bunch. But if you're going to penalize closed primaries, but you're going to be totally fine with caucuses, it's incredibly hypocritical. And it seems like you're just trying to rig the election for the next time, because Clinton cleaned up in the closed primaries because there were no independents who were voting for Sanders. And Bernie cleaned up in the caucuses, right? So it seems like how well did we do it last time? Let's just make those have more delegates.
Yeah, exactly. It clearly,
that's not fair. That's not fair.
Yeah, it's clearly just based around how can we kind of remake the system so Sanders would have won. And yeah, so the issue, yeah, and there's clearly a contradiction there. Like, she's against closed primaries for being undemocratic, but she's for caucuses, which are much less democratic. And there are some people, usually Clinton supporters, who want to do away with caucuses. She's obviously opposed to that, and I don't think she really defends her position very well.
No, I don't think she's really articulated why caucuses are okay and closed primaries are incredibly bad. You know, if I would understand if she said, okay, closed primaries are bad, caucuses are worse, let's get rid of both of them. That would be consistent. But
yeah, I don't know where I come down on the closed primaries, to be honest, because like, closed versus open. Because on the one hand, having an open primary does leave you vulnerable to some kind of hijacking, whether it's like, a bunch of Republicans just like voting for what they view as the worst candidate in your primary, in that particular primary, or whatnot, right? But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who are registered independent or registered Republican who still vote. Yeah, even some registered Republicans who vote Democrat all the time anyway. And so you're kind of leaving them out of an important decision, and they're a very important part of the final election result. So I don't really know where I come down on this. I think I lean towards having them as open primaries. So I agree with her on that. But I mean, she's being totally inconsistent by supporting these ridiculous caucuses.
As far as I'm concerned, I live in New York, and New York, we actually have this rule that to vote in the April primary, you would have had to switch to a Democrat in October of 2015. And a lot of people said nobody was even thinking about the primary in October of 2015. That's really unfair. And a lot of people wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders, but they were registered independents, and they missed the October 15th deadline, and they got incredibly pissed off. And I think that's totally fair. I mean, that's way too early to make the cutoff for changing. So changing that, I totally agree with them on that. But as far as open versus closed, I think it does matter which state you're in and what the relative makeup of the state is. In some states, a lot of people are registered independent. In Colorado or Arizona, it's like 50% of the voters are independent. So to me, in that situation, it makes no sense to really have just 30% of the voters, or half of the people who tend to vote for you decide it. if almost all your voters are registered Democrats, then it's a little bit different. And then I would be fine. To me, I think the compromise is if you have a closed primary, let people switch to your party a month before.
And honestly, I do also get the argument too of like, if you always vote Democrat and you want to vote in Democratic primaries, why not just register as a Democrat? Like if I was in the US, I would just register as Democrat because I would just vote Democrat all the time.
I don't understand that people
like now I know for a lot of the independents, it's kind of like, you know, it feels cool to be an independent, right? That's what fuels a lot of it. But it's interesting when it comes to the registered Republicans that vote Democrat and vice versa, because there's a strong cultural element to that. Like there are a lot of registered Democrats in the South who always vote Republican. They're like, you know, old blue dogs that, you know, just are registered Democrat because that's what their family is, you know?
Right. So
I think it's silly and archaic, but that's,
you know, that's what Dixie crap thing. I mean, I could certainly argue if you're a registered Republican, you shouldn't be allowed to vote in a Democratic primary, pretty much, period. And
yeah, that one's a little tough though, because there are still some people that vote Demo. I don't get why they're registered Republican, but they are.
Right. And I guess in my mind, the argument that it's incredibly onerous to register as a Democrat, I find pretty specious. It seems to me that if you are a left-leaning voter, you should register as a Democrat, kind of, period. It doesn't mean that you love them. You could hate them. You could be you could hate them as, you could be a communist, and it still makes sense to vote in the Democratic primary because you're influencing the party that you hate towards more like your views. Like you have a preference between Sanders and Clinton. If you're a communist, you're going to support Sanders. So it makes sense to be a registered Democrat. And it's not just the presidential primary that counts. You should be voting in every single primary, right? From the school board primary to the city council to state reps, you should be voting for everything.
Yeah, and look, unless you're seriously considering voting in a Green Party primary, like you can still vote for Jill Stein if you really must, you know, in the general election. Like it's not barring you from potentially voting for a third party.
And if you're a conservative Democrat, it makes sense to register as a Republican, because then you can shape the Republican Party towards maybe your moderate views instead of the far right views. Like if you live in a really conservative area and the only chance, and the Democrats will never win anything, it actually makes more sense to register as a Republican. So at least you can vote in the primaries, which are actually competitive and could result in candidates who are a little bit more sane. So, you know, it should be viewed as a strategic thing rather than, okay, you register as a Democrat, therefore you love Hillary Clinton, and you have like a, you know, John F. Kennedy poster on your wall. Like, no.
Yeah, exactly. Just register.
Don't be so precious about it.
Yeah, just like there's two major parties in the United States. Doesn't mean that those are the only two parties you have to vote for in the general, but you might as well exert your influence in one of those parties. Like that's how you make change in the United States under that system. You can work to change it if you want, but that's the best, most realistic way to do it. You do what you can along the way. That's your view.
The other element of this is that the Bernie Sanders people want to get rid of superdelegates.
That's a tough one because on the one hand, superdelegates claimed that they were going to go for Clinton way too early in 2016. I think pretty much everyone can agree with that. It was silly for them to all like jump on board that early. But and it was a bad look. But on the other hand, like, and it is very undemocratic. These are just Democratic Party officials that have huge sway. But there is the risk of what happens if you have a contested convention. Like if nobody gets to that certain delegate number, what do you do? And in that case, superdelegates would step in. Otherwise, delegates would have to like shift and move around. I mean, other countries like Canada actually have other ways of doing these things that's far more democratic to in the case that nobody gets to the threshold they need to hit. But in the United States, I think there's kind of there is a role for superdelegates, but I think that role could be better filled with something else. Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, what I would say is that a lot of people way overestimate the role that they actually have. So you go back to 2008, and Hillary Clinton had this massive lead of superdelegates. But once Obama was leading in pledged delegates, and he was clearly going to win the nomination based on, he won the most delegates. All the Clinton superdelegates were saying, well, you know what? We're not going to use our power to overrule the voters, overrule the democratic process. Yeah, and they're saying, if we do that, Hillary's probably going to lose the election because she won by using the superdelegates to overturn the actual result. And people are going to be pissed off as hell. And I can't imagine the superdelegates actually, like, let's say Hillary lost by 5%. I can't imagine superdelegates saying, you know what, Bernie, you might have won by 5%, but we think Hillary's better, so fuck you, voters.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I actually didn't know about the situation in 2008. I didn't know that there was, like, a huge mountain of superdelegates on Clinton's side then. But yeah, I mean, I do recall, I believe Bill Clinton said, who's as close to the Democratic nominee as anyone could be. I said that should it start going the other way, he would flip,
right,
out of respect for democracy. So, I mean, it does give a lot of too much, in my opinion, gives too much potential discretionary power to certain individuals. But, I mean, I think they generally come around and do the right thing.
Right. Well, to me, what I would do is get rid of that problem by saying, if one candidate wins 50% of the pledged delegates, or wins 50% of the popular vote, or wins 47%, or is by far the leader in a two-way race or something,
yeah,
the superdelegates cannot vote for anyone else. They're all pledged to vote for the winner. If it's like in a situation where it's one candidate has 33%, one candidate has 32%, one candidate has 28%, then let them vote, because then you don't really have a democratic winner. And then you can let them vote in the contested convention, and they can sort of balance it out and perhaps exercise what people would have wanted if they could have voted on, like, the preference of the third place candidate in terms of the top two.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of countries, including Canada, like our Conservative Party recently went to a ranked ballot system, and that's clearly the most democratic way to do it. In my opinion, it's the best way. But honestly, from what I've seen, from what I've heard, nobody's really talking about it in the Democratic Unity Commission, and it doesn't. It would require a pretty major overhaul of how they do things, and I don't think it's in question for 2020. Honestly.
Yeah,
it just hasn't come up.
Here's the problem. A lot of the primaries are not run by the Democratic Party. The primaries,
they're run by the state parties, right?
They're run by the state government. They're run by the state of New York,
right.
State of Arizona, whatever. And to do a ranked choice voting system, you have to overhaul your technology. You have to teach people how to do it.
That's what I mean. It's a huge challenge. You have to upturn everything.
Maine actually just decided to go to ranked choice voting, and a few cities have it. And there's a lot of things to recommend having instant runoff or ranked choice or whatever. There's a lot of arguments to doing that, but you actually need to convince every single state to do that. And
yeah,
that's why, I mean, that's the federal system of the United States. It's kind of this, like, Frankenstein monster sometimes.
And what's tough is that we're just talking right here. I think you're just talking about ranked at the state level, like choosing the delegates from the state. We're not even talking about, like, applying that to the federal convention, where, like, the delegates go to this person based on whatnot. Right. It's much that becomes very difficult to do.
Right. But to me, if you have a deadlocked convention where there's no clear winner of the primaries,
which is very likely in 2020, in my opinion,
there's reasons why it's unlikely to happen. But if you had that situation, then I would say let some superdelegates vote. Maybe have fewer superdelegates, but letting them vote, to overturn democracy, I would say just make that an impossibility. However you have to do it. If there's clearly a winner, if it's a two-way race and one candidate won, even if it's by 2% or 5%, that candidate should win, period.
Yeah, or you could just look at, maybe they don't even have to hit the threshold. Just whoever's in the lead. Like, that might just be like the easiest to communicate to people way to do it.
but let's say you have a three-way race. Let's say Bernie Sanders has 33%, and the other two candidates are, they agree with their supporters like each other more than Bernie Sanders. So actually, Bernie Sanders has, he's losing 2-1, but he's number one in plurality. In that situation, it's not fair that he would win.
Yeah, it's not fair, but I mean, yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's not ideal compared to some kind of ranked system, but it's probably better than just having super delegates come in and pick who they like most, right? Like, it'd be easiest to justify if they just go to the person with the most delegates.
I would say, to me, that you could find some formula to say either if you have 50% of the popular vote, or you have 50% of the delegates, or it's a two-way race and you won, then you should get it. If it's a four-way race and you have 25% and you're saying that you have 26% and it's completely 50-50,
Right, and usually candidates drop out and they time their dropping out to benefit the person they want to win in a way that'll help them hit 50%, or hit that key number, right?
Right.
So there's normally those calculations that kind of prevent these sort of three-way messes.
Right, and it's very unlikely to happen. Usually, what happens is that the candidates drop out pretty early in the race.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And by the time you get to May or April, you only have two candidates left.
Yeah,
and what's always happened. We've had a two-way race, a strong two-way race, the whole way, the last two contested primaries. But even that is actually pretty unlikely. What happens a lot of times is that one candidate just surges forward and kicks everyone else's ass.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, there's been, you can look at the history of these primaries. There's like, probably most primaries, one person just totally cleans up and there's no worries about this stuff. But however, I just look at 2020. I look at how factioned and, kind of and just how messy the state of the American left is right now. And I look at how big the potential field could be and the divisiveness. And I think, 2016 basically broke politics. If there was going to be some kind of big contested convention mess, I don't know if I'd bet on it, but I would say there's a pretty, 2020 wouldn't be a surprising year for it to happen.
Right. I mean, it's certainly a possibility. Let's say you
exactly, yeah. Like, if it happened, I wouldn't be shocked. Just looking at the field, how big it is, and looking at how divided and
here's how I could see it happening. I could say Bernie Sanders running for president, and he doesn't do as well as last time, but he has his core of support, and he gets his chunk. And then there is a candidate who does really well in some community, like one candidate who does really well with black voters and gets a big chunk. That's a lot of voters. That's a lot of delegates if you just win the South, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then another candidate does really well with, white conservative Democrats and, wealthier people who's like more moderate. You could see a three-way split that way. And
this is how I've sort of seen a three-way split. And this is actually not two of these things are quite similar to what you described. I kind of see one candidate, be it like a Bernie Sanders or a Sherrod Brown, somebody who's like, more populist, probably sort of protectionist, appealing a bit more to like leftists and the working class, doing well in some places like the Midwest, the West, I should say, and Appalachia and whatnot. And then I see another candidate, probably a minority candidate, maybe Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, doing really well among African Americans. And then I actually see, looking at the modern Democratic Party, I see like kind of a coastal liberal. So this could be like Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, somebody who does well in the Northeast and possibly on the West Coast. That's actually, I know Bernie does pretty well in that area actually. But I see it kind of coming down something like that. You got kind of like the suburban liberal kind of vote, which is sort of, the Kirsten Gillibrand would probably do great among like suburban moms, for example. And then you have like the the old left sort of working class Appalachian guy, and then you have the minority candidate. That's how I could see a three-way race forming. I'll put that to you. Do you think that's a decent interpretation, or do you differ somewhere?
Well, I think it's actually kind of unlikely. Well, I think you're kind of buying into the left wing sort of canard about how politics works, in that you're kind of arguing that people in Appalachia are going to be drawn to the left wing candidate.
Well, the person who can strike the right tone, like Bernie Sanders is fairly liked, and I mean, not relative to maybe, some other potential politicians, but relative to Hillary Clinton, he was quite liked in West Virginia. Somebody who kind of strikes it. They're not going to read his policy portfolio, but it's part of its tonal as well, right?
Right.
Like it's a messaging and the feel of a candidate. That's arguably much more important than the policy. It's like how they feel.
On the other hand, Hillary Clinton won West Virginia by
in 2000, but in 2008. Yeah, because she was more like, she was a little bit more like Sanders in tone and targeted demographic then. Other than the young people, she was playing more to like the white working class in that election. The young people went to Obama. It doesn't break down the same way, but she was kind of messaging to the white working class in a fairly successful way.
Let me just put it to a different way.
Okay.
The people who are white working class are Democrats in West Virginia, are not going to vote for the Democratic nominee, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders. Most of them are not, or majority of them are not.
Oh yeah, Trump won in an absolute landslide there.
Yeah, he probably won the majority of Democrats in West Virginia.
Oh yeah, well, because they elect Joe Manchin. He's like a total like anti-environment asshole. I mean, they love him there.
Right. So West Virginia, they're going to vote against the Democratic frontrunner because they're like, I hate Democrats. These are a bunch of these liberal jerks. And I don't like them. I don't like, if they don't love Bernie Sanders, they're not against Hillary Clinton.
I think in a primary,
they're not against Hillary Clinton because they think that she's too conservative. They think that Hillary Clinton is too liberal.
On certain issues, right? Like Bernie Sanders, if he has the more like jobs kind of campaign, and Clinton has the more sort of anti discrimination campaign, appealing more to minorities, and that's a tonal thing, right?
Talking about jobs to people in West Virginia is not the same as talking about jobs to people in Seattle. It's not even
exactly
close.
That's why I don't think that's why.
So Bernie Sanders is going to them and saying, you know what, we need to have a massive carbon tax, and we need to get rid of fracking, and we need to do all. They're like, get the hell out of here, old man.
But that's why I said policy really isn't every a lot of it is how the candidate makes them feel, right?
If it was if we had an election between Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin in West Virginia,
Joe Manchin would win in an absolute landslide.
Exactly.
I have no doubt about that. I'm talking about specifically in the primary, though, and where tone matters a lot. Policy matters, I think, a bit more in the primary than in a general election, just because those are the people that vote in a primary.
Yeah, I think I just in general, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen a month from now.
Yeah,
predicting what's going to happen 4 years from now without even knowing who the candidates are.
Maybe I shouldn't have been maybe I shouldn't have really threw Bernie in as an example, because he's kind of a tough one where he does tonally appeal to these people, but his policies in some cases are totally the opposite of what they would support. Like, I live in Canada. In Canada, we have friggin' $20 per ton carbon tax, and people are losing their minds over it. They're so mad about it. Where Sanders supported a huge carbon tax, and once that got out, some of these people theoretically would be against him. But there is stuff like that. So Sanders isn't a great example.
Well,
but I could see somebody like that, somebody who's a little more jobs and angry, kind of winning these white working class people. That's one person I could see in a three-way race.
Well, here's the thing. I would say every single primary election is somewhat sui generis, because
somewhat what? Sorry?
Sui generis. It's its own thing. It doesn't follow the pattern of what happened before. There's different candidates each time. They have different attributes. They could be from the South. They could be white. They could be Jewish. They could be a really good, inspiring speaker. They could appeal to young people. You know, there's a lot of attributes that people could have independent of each other. And then there's, you know, you have a race between, you know, a candidate who is super experienced and, you know, seems like really steady. That might be a really good candidate if you have a national crisis and we just had a president who is like, seems like they're really out, you know.
Yeah. Could say, imagine what okay, if Trump goes, imagine if Trump goes like super protectionist and grocery prices skyrocket. Bernie Sanders like candidate isn't going to do well in 2020.
Right.
Context matters. A lot of it comes down to how Trump's presidency goes.
Well, context in politics is everything. You know, if you look at it, you know, it's very hard to replace a two-term Democrat with a Democrat. People just tend to want a new thing. The party that's out of power can sort of talk about, I represent change, I'm different.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Bernie Sanders did have a strength, specifically in 2020. In 2016, in the sense that he's like a Democrat, but he's not, you know, right. He's very different than like Obama on some issues. He does speak about change constantly. He does criticize Obama in a way that Clinton was very wary not to, partially to win the black vote, partially just because she agreed with him on a lot of stuff. So in that sense, for this specific year, it very well, I'm not one of those like, you know, ram it down people's throats, Bernie would have won, but he probably would have won. I mean, Clinton probably would have won too, although like, you know, the timing didn't really work out. But it was probably, if Sanders had a year, this was probably his year. Had he done more to like build relationships and name recognition and all of that before he ran, he maybe could have won the primary and he probably would have won the presidency. But I'm just saying, like in 2020, you know, if some of Trump's populist ideas actually go through and end up bad, then Sanders isn't the guy for 2020.
The moment, the context is everything.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we've been talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, the Hillary Clinton was exactly the wrong type of candidate for 2016. If you had picked, you couldn't pick someone who was worse, really. I mean, Jeb Bush was the Hillary Clinton of the Republican Party. And Jeb Bush, he was terrible. He didn't win anything. He was like lucky to come in 5th place in a lot of these early primaries. His campaign had $120 million to start with. So Hillary did pretty well considering the fact that she was exactly the wrong kind of candidate for 20.
Yeah, and I mean, in some respects, she was up against a candidate that was a very poor candidate. But, you know, Trump was a good candidate in some ways for 2016, right? Like, you know. Like, I mean, there obviously, like when you look at why Trump won, you know, there's partisanship, there's, you know, there's elements of, you know, racism, but there's also just like he was a big, brash kind of change candidate, and that works with some key voters. So even for him, he was a pretty good candidate for this year.
Well, I would just say most times you have an open seat election, the candidate who represents change tends to win, it seems like. And if you want to represent change, Barack Obama represented change. You know, he seemed like he was not part of the Democratic Party because he was talking about, you know, there's not a, you know, red America, there's not a blue America, there's United States. I mean, he represented a new kind of politics, and he wasn't tied to the Clintons. He wasn't tied to these people that people already hated.
Yeah, whereas Clinton was directly tied to Obama, and unlike Obama, she has had like a bunch of scandals, some manufactured, some not. So like she's really like one of the worst candidates you could have run in a year like this.
Right. Well, she had a lot of liabilities that were not her fault. They weren't. You know, she didn't choose to be. Her campaign didn't say, you know what, let's have someone who is been in politics for 40 years and has been intimately connected to the last 2 Democratic presidents. They didn't decide that was who she was, but she was that, and it was a huge liability for her. I mean, that's part of the reason that when people say the primary was rigged for against Bernie, because he was not the candidate of the establishment. That was a huge, great thing for Bernie Sanders that he was not seen as the DNC's pick.
Yeah, it would actually probably help him, right? You know,
it was a huge advantage for him that he was not seen as tied to Democrats.
Yeah, he was like Obama was the underdog too. Everyone was supporting Clinton, and then like this Obama guy comes in and takes away from her.
Right. And Obama and Bernie Sanders, if you look at the exit polls, they won independent voters, people who didn't consider themselves Democrats.
Yeah.
They love somebody in a change election who says, you know what, Democrats kind of suck in a lot of ways. That's a great message. And it's not a message that you can run on. And it's not likely to win necessarily if you're Bernie Sanders, because you're attacking, you're going after, 40% of the party who's dissatisfied. But if you're a Democrat, you're probably going to like the Democratic Party. So it's kind of not a great message to go as hard as he did against the establishment.
Yeah, like when you look at who supported Clinton, it was basically Democratic stalwarts, like people who not only are in like the demographics of people that usually would vote Democrat, but people who actually do get out and vote Democrat. People who are very committed to the party, African Americans, Hispanics, whatnot. Whereas with Sanders, the voters, they're usually a little bit more unpredictable, like, young people and whatnot, in terms of whether or not they get out to vote. But, they're very much in that camp. And I think where he really failed was in the South. Now, me and you had an argument on Twitter that I'd like to touch on here about whether the South has way too much influence in a primary, whereas it has like none in a general. We can talk about that later, but I think he really flubbed the South. I think he had a really good opportunity to highlight his civil rights record and some of his policy history that really contrasted Clinton's with respect to African Americans, and he just totally flubbed it. Like, that was a part of the reason why he lost.
To some degree, I mean, he tried to attack Hillary, or a lot of people on the left attacked Hillary because Bill Clinton signed the 1994 crime bill.
Which Bernie Sanders voted for, right? So I'm less concerned. I'm less concerned about that. I don't think that issue is actually as much of a concern as people think it is.
I think a lot of his problem was that he didn't have the money, and he didn't know he was going to have the money.
Yeah, well, he probably wasn't expecting to win, right? So he didn't really bother, building relationships, getting cozier with the institutions, that can give you endorsements and whatnot. And he didn't really, wasn't prepared to be running like this huge campaign.
He didn't try to win the Tennessee primary or the Alabama primary or the Georgia primary, and he lost those states by such a massive margin. If he could have lost them even by 60-40, he would have had much more of a chance.
I have a theory, though, why Bernie Sanders probably was a little afraid to try to go for like the South, which entails, right, a lot of African American voters in the Democratic primary, was that he probably knew he had a lot of white voters, some of whom were like kind of white working class voters. And some of the stuff they liked about Bill Clinton was like, the welfare reform and that kind of stuff. And like Sanders theoretically could have talked about how like welfare reform is racialized and how Clinton, proudly wrote in her memoir about helping round up votes for it, which is kind of one of the more effed up things she's done. But like he could have gone hard on that, but I think he kind of refrained because he knew that might act like that some of his voters might have actually liked it theoretically.
Well, and I'd also think that the Clintons have been in Democratic politics for a long time, and a lot of black voters are lifelong Democrats.
Exactly. They're committed to the party, right? And
I mean, I have sort of a similar situation because my family is all Jews and from New York and like white not ethnic, but white lower middle class people from New York. So we're all people who voted Democrat every single election going back. And it's sort of like, our football team. We always support Democrats, and we like Obama. We like Bill Clinton, going back, we like every Democrat.
No, I like them too. I don't mean like when I'm talking with like, in my opinion, welfare reform was one of like the few things Clinton did wrong. I think he was a really good president. He's maybe the best living politician. As an aside point, but
if you're president for 8 years, you're gonna make a whole lot of horrible mistakes.
Exactly, but like overall, he was a good president. That's the thing. Democrats have a much better record on presidents than the Republicans do. Jesus.
Oh, I mean, Bush and Trump is gonna be hard to live down.
Oh my God, even Reagan was awful. He was a horrible president. He was awful. His foreign policy, like Jesus, like don't even get me started on that guy. So Democrats do have a lot to be proud of in their history, but
right. But so the people who are Democrats in rural Georgia, and a lot of them are also, they saw Hillary Clinton. She was Obama's Secretary of State. She was Bill Clinton's wife. She lived in the South. She asked for their vote. She worked really hard to, meet the people who are in the Congressional Black Caucus, get good relationships with them, get good relationships with the black clergy. And she spent 40 years, working on understanding the black voters, understanding that community, and building relationships with it. And so it's almost impossible for Bernie Sanders to come in there and be like, hey, black voters, Hillary's terrible and she doesn't like you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. One really good thing to note, and that Democrats need to take note of, is that the Clintons did a really good job of gaining and maintaining support among both white, middle, and working class people and minorities. It's like a really tough rope to walk on, and they actually managed to do it. Now, obviously, that fell apart in 2016 because Trump came in and took all the white voters. But I mean, they actually managed to balance that really well back in the 90s.
Well, if you go back to Bill Clinton in 1992, I mean, I wasn't conscious of this because I was a little boy, but a lot of what Bill Clinton's incredible political genius was that he was able to appeal to the white working class by doing identity politics. Like Bill Clinton's famously, he criticized Sister Souljah for her lyrics that were about, police officers that were like offensive to. It was kind of like a Trump maneuver of signaling to on the cultural issues, the white working class, and saying, I don't like that stuff. And Bill Clinton he was tough on crime. That was
exactly.
One of the things
that was part of in response to Dukakis, right? With the Willie Horton ad and stuff.
Well, Bill Clinton was saying, I'm not one of those liberal, teetotaling, or not teetotaling, but liberal like wimps who's not willing to go out and enforce laws. And I'm not culturally part of the elite, East Coast effete liberal left. That was what he was trying to say.
Arkansas, right? This guy was from Arkansas. He had a very nice Southern drawl. The guy had a Southern drawl, and so did his running mate.
Right, and Bill Clinton, but what he did was that he actually did court the black vote and worked really hard on it.
Yeah, exactly.
And he didn't, he walked a line that was possible to walk, and it was a different moment in history because crime was out of control compared to where it is now. And people were much more on board for tough on crime policies, and they were much more. It was a more conservative country in a lot of ways in 1992.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's often been pointed out, and the interesting thing is, I mean, I actually am relatively tough on crime for a liberal, and I think I absolutely would have supported the crime bill back in the day, as did a lot of African Americans back in the day, because a lot of the crime was disproportionately in their neighborhoods. It was disproportionately their kids getting, hopped up on drugs and stuff. And I mean, that sounds racist, but it's not racist. It's just disproportionately, that's where a lot of the issues were. And they actually supported it. And it actually did help in some of those respects.
There was a split in the black community about the crime bill and about a lot of these policies. The fact of the matter is, if you look at hiring more police officers and that might have had an effect positively on crime. On the other hand, a lot of it just might have been, there was this population level trend for a variety of reasons why crime went down. Well,
there's the economy. The economy took off, right?
The economy got better. I mean, there's all this sort of social science about what makes crime go up. A lot of people say that the fact that we stopped putting lead in gasoline and it's actually made crime that. Less lead poisoning made crime go down a lot because there was a lot fewer people who were brain damaged from lead and didn't have good impulse control. And the fact that we had unleaded gasoline for 20 years made crime go down at a certain point. There's actually a pretty good argument for that. And I could let's just say video games probably reduced crime to a certain degree because there was fewer kids who were 15 years old who were looking for something to do and went out and shot somebody and said they were playing, NBA Jam.
Yeah, and also the one big thing about video games, I think you're leading to this because I thought you were gonna say they don't need to shoot somebody for real because they can do it in a game. But yeah, like it has been pointed out, like there's real reason to believe that video games have reduced what otherwise would have been pretty bad inner city or just really anywhere violence, because they literally keep kids inside. So like if you're in an inner city and there's like a gang on your street, you're just simply as much less likely to come in contact with them to a to a bad degree if you're inside playing video games more. Like it's simple stuff like that even that can make that crime rate.
And I think what a lot of people also didn't necessarily think about in 1994 was the effect of the mandatory minimums and the high incarceration rate was going to have on the Black community. And if you look at the data and you get a sense of it, a lot of what we did that was tough on crime, it didn't necessarily help that much, or it helped a little bit on crime on the margins, but it had this incredibly negative impact on people. And people going to prison for a really long time, and people who get into that cycle of, once you're in prison and you have a felony, you can't get a job, and you're sort of, it destroyed a lot of lives. And a lot of people in retrospect, they wouldn't have supported it knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah, and well, bear in mind though, there was undeniably a lot. It was like an omnibus bill, right? There's a lot of great stuff in it, like violent, like the Violence Against Women Act, the assault weapons ban, all that kind of stuff was So it was a good omnibus bill. Like, I mean, I think Sanders cited those two parts of it as to why he voted for it. And also, yeah, it's also tough because you have to look at like, what are people going to jail for? And if we were, I mean, there's no reason to do this, but if we were to like narrow it to like say the African American community, it's way too many people going to jail for like drug offenses and not enough going to jail for like murder. And so like overall the numbers should be lower, but I mean, America in general still has a very high violent crime rate, and that needs to be dealt with. It's really a matter of like who is going to jail, and there's huge numbers of people going to jail for like stupid little things that don't really matter.
Right. Well, I think though that there is a lot of there's a really interesting public policy debate about policing and what the best way to do it is. I think a lot of the debate on the left gets a little bit it becomes this like either you're for policing or you're against it. People who think we should abolish prison, we should abolish police officers.
I don't even know how that's supposed to work. Like, what, you can just murder people and have with no consequences? Like, I don't even get what they're even suggesting there.
Yeah, to me that's just, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's not really worth considering that much. But there are things like community policing. There are things, training police officers. So if you look at just like the difference between New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago, New York City has a massive lower number of police shootings and shootings in general. And the way they do policing is we put a lot of resources into it, but it actually probably is a lot better. It's not perfect. There are a lot of racist cops who beat people up in New York, but it's a lot better. And, it's a lot of the discussion about policing needs to get a little bit more granular and into, okay, what is evidence-based and what works, and what is just people being hysterical and saying, oh no, crime, we need to be tough on crime.
Yeah, exactly. You know what, I find this a very interesting subject, but I think we should return to, the subjects at hand here.
Right.
The theme of this stream.
All right. So we're going. You were saying this. The South should not get.
Right. Yeah. That's something that I don't really know specifically how to deal with it best, but there is real, the argument about the South having an illogical amount of power in the primary, I think carries a lot of water. Now, I mean, obviously it's most democratic, and it's just the right thing to do if in a primary, if every member of the party, especially if they're like, registered Democrats who turn out and vote all the time, have an equal say, or like a mostly equal say in who the nominee is, because they're members of the party, and that's the point. That's the spirit of the primary season. But at the same time, you're also trying to pick somebody who can win, because as the primary goal of the DNC and the primary goal of the party really is to win as an institution. And so I don't think it lends itself I don't think that having the South have equal power translates well to winning in a general election, simply because the Democratic Party in the modern age, not since Bill Clinton has it won like any southern states except for Florida. So so there's these voters who vote in the primary, have enormous sway in the primary. They have power to either, especially given when they vote, put wind in the sails of or crush a campaign. Yet they actually have no real power in the general election because it's winner takes all with the Electoral College. And just one thing I'll note, I personally think, and this is something we could also touch on, we could talk about candidates more broadly if you want to later on. I think Cory Booker, it would be a terrible candidate for 2020. And if Cory Booker ran and it was like a two-way race, three-way race, he would have a really good chance of winning because of the South. And I don't want to paint like all African Americans is just like voting for the African American candidate, because that's not true. That's clearly not true. Like a third of them still voted for Sanders. I mean Clinton, while not African American, had was very much tying herself to Barack Obama. So it's not like that. They're not a monolith, but people are tribal. And so by that virtue alone, Cory Booker could end up, cleaning the South early on. A bunch of people drop out and he's the nominee, which I think would be a disaster for a lot of reasons. And so I think there's real concern there. It's just, I honestly don't have a solution to deal with it that wouldn't cause great outrage. And you know what I mean? It's a really tough situation. I think it's a problem. And I think it's something that Democrats, wherever they live, have to think strategically about. There is this Southern question that always comes into play in the primary, but I don't have a solution offhand.
Well, would you say that Obama was a better candidate than Hillary in 2008?
I think he probably was. Mind you, I think 2008 Hillary was actually a better candidate in general than 2016 Hillary. I think both. I think either of them would have won. The Republicans, but it would be a miracle for John McCain to win, given that his president, prior to him, had like a 25% approval rating. But you know what? I don't think Clinton would have won by the margin that Obama did.
So in that case, the black voters in the South actually tipped the balance.
Potentially won them that election. I don't think Clinton would have lost, but they helped them win by a huge margin. May have helped them pick up all the House and Senate seats they did, because Obama got this momentum behind the Democratic Party.
Right.
So in that case it helps, but I can just see potentially that might just be luck. It might just be luck that Barack Obama happened to be really such a fantastic candidate who really knew how to speak to people in other areas. Because I look at somebody like Cory Booker, and I'm not going to lump Kamala Harris in with here, because I really think she is a better candidate than Cory Booker. But like somebody like Cory Booker, who would win the South, but unlike Obama, has no idea how to talk to like people in places like where I live. I don't live in America, but I live in a place that's very similar to the Midwest. Like he would not win like any votes where I live, because he just doesn't, unless they're like hyper partisan votes, because he does not know how to talk to a certain type, like to a certain kind of voter that you need in the general election. Like, so I'm thinking, in that case with Obama, they helped, but that might just be they got lucky that Obama was like a guy that really, almost like a chameleon, really knows how to speak knows how to speak to people at the right time and in the right way.
Well, but the fact that Obama won the South, he won. If you take out the South, Clinton wins 2008.
Yeah,
and it's certainly possible, if 1992 goes a little differently. If you take out the South, you have a different candidate, wins. That race.
Clinton basically cleaned up, so it's possible, but that's a little different.
But a lot of the reason that Bill Clinton won the primary in 1992, to be a little bit factual about it, is that he started winning the southern states because he was. So it's possible
there, but that's it. But the party was a little different back then, though. Like they still had a decent presence in the South, like enough of a presence to be tapped and potentially used for victory. Whereas now they really don't. It's
you can't say that
party.
The people in the South, who they support is not predictive of who's going to win. You're
Yeah,
saying,
but I'm trying to, because the party is always changing. I mean, history does matter, obviously, especially very recent history, but because the party is always changing, and because like I don't I try to just look at it like as the current situation, because it's always an evolving situation, you know. Uh,
uh-huh.
and I potentially see 2020 as a situation where this, if the people who I think are going to run, I see it then as, the chickens are coming home to roost in a really bad way potentially. But that's you raised a good point with Obama and Clinton being good candidates. Yeah, so I mean it's hard to predict. I can just see scenarios where it's
And
potentially problematic.
couldn't I say, well, you know what, who really shouldn't pick the nominee are these super liberal places like, Portland, Oregon, and Vermont, and Seattle, and
Because they're going to vote Democrat anyway,
they're going
right?
to vote Democrat anyway, and they're going to
Yeah,
support the most left-wing candidate. So I
that,
don't
that's
want them. I don't want
that's
them
why
to.
theoretically you'd think that it's the swing states, and this doesn't just go for the South. Honestly, there's lots of like states in the heartland that will never go Democrat, that have they don't have as much power as the South, but that they have power. And yeah, so you'd think you'd want to like weight it more to swing states, and ideally then have open primaries in those swing states. It's not
But
perfect. It might just be a
and
better
it,
thing to avoid in general because of all the controversy it would create.
well, and I'd say the
Um,
other thing is, let's say you have a candidate who's more moderate and it might lose a swing state because the more left-wing candidate beats them, but they're actually going to be they're more likely to win that swing state because they're a more moderate voice or whatever. Let's just say, for example, let's
well,
say,
yeah, I would say in order for this to actually work as intended to any degree, it would have to be open primaries. It would have to be where you get, a lot of people from that state voting in the primary, like a diverse voter base, and
well,
that state that starts to represent more of the people that would vote Democratic, that could vote Democratic.
let's just say, for example, it's a primary race between um, a Bernie Sanders kind of candidate and uh, a Sherrod Brown kind of candidate. So they're both
pretty very similar candidates.
well, somewhat similar. One's a bit more moderate. One's more left-wing identified, more democratic socialist versus a populist liberal Democrat.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
possible,
Sherrod Brown is basically just a normal Democrat, but he's more protectionist, more or less.
right? So,
Like he isn't constantly talking about free college and stuff like that.
right, he's more pragmatic. Let's say
Sure.
it's possible that the less pragmatic candidate is going to win the primary, and because it's more tilted towards people on the left side of the spectrum. But actually, the candidate who lost the primary in that state actually appeals more to the state as a whole. So winning a primary is not necessarily, it's somewhat indicative, but it's not necessarily indicative of the fact that you're going to win that state. And
that's why you'd want it to be you'd want it to be as like open as possible. You'd want as many people from that state who could theoretically vote Democrat voting in that primary. You'd really want to encourage it.
So like you can go back in history, right? And you could say, you know what, like the Democrats, if they had, nominated John Glenn instead of Walter Mondale, they would have done better in 1984. So let's just get rid of all the states that voted for Walter Mondale, and let's just find all the states that would have been better for John Glenn. So let's only let Ohio vote. The primary should have just been Ohio, and Democrats would have done better. Maybe that's true.
Yeah. No, I get you can take it to that. Yeah, and it's a slippery slope.
Well, it's very hard to sort of make rules that will reliably come up with, okay, this is the best candidate to win the general election based on, and you and I actually don't know this. Like, you think that Cory Booker is a bad candidate. I can understand where people are coming from on that, but I don't know if it's necessarily true. And you don't know Cory Booker that well. You wouldn't have thought that Trump was a good candidate, right?
Well, I mean, he does have, I don't know about that, because I always thought he was actually a decent candidate because he was like like he obviously has all the gas and stuff, but he comes across as being sort of like a straight talker. He's moderate on a lot of issues that other Republicans are moderate on. Like he's not running on cutting Social Security like a lot of idiots in the Republican primary were. I think he's a better candidate than people. He was a better candidate than people gave him credit for. I actually always thought that.
Well,
but I'm a little unique in that sense. Like I was always kind of like, this guy could actually win. Yeah.
Well, I don't think anyone is a perfect political prognosticator. I don't think you are. I don't think I am.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we should say, okay, this person knows who's a good candidate, who's a bad candidate. So they should be able to like jerry rig the rules to.
No, yeah.
So if it was possible to come up with rules that made the Democrats more likely to win, I would say, you know what? There is an argument for that. Because winning the general election is one of the most important things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, in the context of where we are now, with the party at its current state of evolution, you know, looking at who backs them, who the candidates are likely to be, and all that, I would say if you want to do that specifically in 2020, if you wanted to kind of rig it essentially so it works more towards the favor of being able to win the general, I would say you'd want to downplay the power of the South. But you know what? Like, you know, conditions on the ground can change. It's a different party than it was 20 years ago, and 20 years in the future, it'll probably be different. And so you don't want to change the rules in a way that could be permanent or like just in hindsight just look and are unfair in the moment. And
right.
It does come down to like basic fairness too, which is where I think the biggest counter argument comes from. Like if you're just a raw pragmatist, you would like constantly be like changing the rules of it and everything. So like in different years, it's like geared more towards like picking the better candidate. But ultimately, like you do want the people to be able to speak. You know, like that's ultimately the point, right? So right. I get basically all the arguments. I'm not entirely sure where I come down on it.
Here's the other thing. You know, for maybe 30 or 40 years, the whole argument for Democrats was you need to pick a centrist, moderate candidate to win. And
whereas that's a little different now, because now we have the situation where the left is just like, we're not going to vote for a moderate candidate. So, or at least some part of the left.
Well, I think a lot of people have realized that a lot of voters do not pay attention to the specific fine details of policy. So actually being a centrist can be bad for your political, you know, like fortunes. You can it's actually better to be a little bit extreme on some issues, but show passion and show you care. And the voters are not going to be like nitpick you on little policy issues where you might be more to the, you know, political extremes. Because a lot of times, if you run a centrist campaign, Republicans will say, this guy's a Marxist. You get hit, you get attacked for being super far left, even if you're a centrist. So it almost does you no good to be a centrist. You know, the argument goes.
Especially, yeah. Oh, carry on.
So but then you could have said, okay, let's rig the process so the most centrist, moderate candidate wins. That would not necessarily come out with the best candidate in reality. So these theories about who is going to be good and who's going to be bad, it never actually works out as well as you think it's going to work out.
And I would just add to what you were saying about the situation between like a centrist versus a leftist is that in our current moment, it's actually especially, the argument is especially powerful for running a leftist, because when you have somebody like Trump, that most people on the center just want to get out of office. Like they want almost anybody but Trump, save for maybe like a Ted Cruz. Then they're going to vote for the leftist candidate. And on top of that, you're also going to get the leftists who might refuse to vote for a centrist voting for them. So in this particular instant, like place in time, it's better probably to run a leftist, whereas in the 90s, it was better clearly to run a centrist.
Right. Or, you know, maybe it was better to run somebody who galvanized voters in some way, whether it was by their personality or by their policies.
It was a less partisan time. We're so hyper partisan now that back then you actually, like a guy like Bill Clinton could maybe get some Republicans. He did get a lot of people that voted for Republican in the past, but like, you know, it was a less partisan time too. So that's something you have to take into equation. It's an extremely partisan moment we're in right now.
Right. So I understand where you're coming from on that. But to me, the basic thing is that people in Alabama who are Democrats should have as much it should be their say, and people from Wisconsin and California. I mean, everyone should get a vote, it seems to me. And even people who are not even part of the United States get a vote. People who are in Guam.
I don't doubt they should vote. I just like wonder if there's some way you can like lessen the like, I don't know, tone down the number of delegates or like something like that. I'm not talking about like eliminating them.
Well, currently,
I don't have that in the question. You know, that's not
currently the states that Democrats win get a delegate bonus.
Right, but isn't that largely like, and they also obviously the number of delegates is tuned to the number of registered Democrats in the state, right?
It's some sort of, I don't know the exact equation.
Yeah,
but it's there's an equation based on, you know, how many representatives you have of Democrats and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, even if there's more delegates in that raw sense, it doesn't change that at this moment in time the South has disproportionate power in a primary relative to a general, but like in terms of the Democratic side. But yeah, that's you made good points in what you said just a minute ago.
Right. And I would just say, you know, going forward, we don't know who's going to run. We don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah.
Predicting it's a little bit of a fool's errand because, you know, you can predict pretty well once you know who the candidates are and there's polling and everything. And it's a week before the election. If it's years out and you don't even know who it's going to be,
with some people we have a pretty good idea. Like I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that Cory Booker is going to run. Would you agree with that?
No.
Oh, you think he might not? Oh, okay. Well,
I don't think it's certain. I think he probably, you know, he's somebody who, you know, he has that resume of someone who's really ambitious and really has he's been very media savvy, let's say, because there's a documentary about him running for mayor of Newark.
Oh, I heard about that. I almost don't want to. I don't know. He makes me cringe a little. Like I don't know. Like a lot of people don't have that reaction, but like I don't know. Like I don't. He just makes me cringe up a bit. I don't know if I could watch that. Like I mean, I've listened to some podcasts with him, and he's all right. But sometimes when he's doing like, you know, big antics, it's sort of, I don't know. I don't know what your response is, but yeah.
I mean, you know, Barack Obama was a figure who had that sort of ability to do the soaring rhetoric and was able to sort of get to that place. But Barack Obama, when he's talking to you, is this much more of a cool customer.
He's very casual when he's.
Whereas I think Cory Booker is a little bit more nerdy.
He's also a little more like. I think that with Obama, there's a greater degree of trust because he just. Now I have to say, Cory Booker is one of the most articulate people in politics.
He's brilliant.
But he's clearly extremely smart, but he comes across as almost a little too slick, you know, like almost like a really well-spoken salesman to a degree, and I think that catches people a little off guard. Now, I mean, like with some people, it works very well and they like that. But I think it kind of leads to the impression among people that he's not all talk, but you know, he's a lot of talk and he's a lot of
So you're saying it's kind of like why people didn't like Marco Rubio.
Exactly. Yeah, he's a lot like Marco Rubio in the sense that he's so polished, he's very well spoken, he's very smart, but he's almost just too slick. It like, you know, reminds people of maybe somebody who cheated them or sold them out on something. I think that some people have that response. I don't really. I just more find like some of his other stuff kind of cringy. But I think that doesn't help you. Maybe at one time it did help you, but I think that with current perceptions of politicians and just people in power in general, I don't think it actually helps you.
So in my mind, like my read on Cory Booker is that he's an incredibly sincere person. And he's just like the nicest person you'll ever meet in your life. And he just has this personality that's just like really enthusiastic and really into everything. And like, you know, he saved somebody from a burning building.
Yeah, I heard about that. I mean, that was good.
No, like, that's like, he's really like that. Like, and I've actually met him once. I heard him give a speech and I shook his hand, but he is one of those people where you're like, like this guy is like, like he lights up the room and he's an amazing presence. And he literally is the person that he portrays himself as. It's not like an act. It's not like, oh, he's putting you on.
Yeah, because that's the thing. I'm not sure. Some people are convinced it's an act. I can't really tell personally, but you seem to have gotten to see him a little more, and you don't think it's an act.
I think part of his problem is that he took some positions as mayor of Newark, where if you're the mayor of a city, basically you have to try to work with the business community to get investment into your city. So
Yeah.
he had to sort of make nice with a lot of people who are, banks and private equity. And
Well, he famously defended what was it, Bain Capital against like Obama's criticisms of them and Mitt Romney.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, basically, if you're the mayor of Newark, you're trying to negotiate with those banks to say, you know what, instead of putting your next big building in Jersey City, put it in Newark. And I want to negotiate with you because that's going to create jobs and that's going to bring in and people who live in my city who work, who I know who are unemployed. I want them to work in that building. I want them to have that investment in their city. I want the tax base of my city to go up so we can spend more on schools. So my job is basically to be a cheerleader for my city and not to, go after people or.
Yeah.
So his role was a lot different when he was a mayor.
There's a clear carry on. Yeah.
So to me, I don't view him as he's a sellout kind of guy. I don't think he's a sellout at all. I just think that he's somebody who was very task oriented when it came to being a mayor. But I think it's certainly possible that you could be a great person. You could be brilliant. You could be the perfect person for the job. But if you are not somebody who is going to win, I don't want to support you. Right.
The thing is with Cory Booker is that some of the issues that he has as a candidate and as a politician for the country at large are not unique to him. They're actually just sort of structural disadvantages that people from the Northeast have in a populist age, so to speak. Like, yeah, he takes a lot of money from people in finance because you know what? There's a lot of people that work in finance that live in New Jersey. And if you are, from Vermont, you're not going to have that issue. So there is kind of a structural, and you're going to be a little more friendly. You're not going to talk about breaking up the banks or whatever if you're from this area because you're potentially threatening jobs of your constituents. So there is that disadvantage that a lot of people from the Northeast in general have on some of those issues if they're wanting to go for like a populist voting base. And I think it's unfair in some ways. But, I mean, in the case of Cory Booker, like, he's got a fairly safe seat up there as, like, a Democrat in New Jersey who's pretty not super popular, but reasonably popular. Like, he doesn't need to take as much money as he does from, he clearly doesn't need that much money. And when there's, like, stats out there that, like, he's taken the second most money from Wall Street just after Mitch McConnell, it's a really bad look. Like, he's not doing himself any favors. He probably doesn't need that money. It looks suspicious. It is sort of suspicious, and I don't even know why he does that, honestly.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't seen the stats on that. But the thing I think with a lot of liberals, and part of the reason that Trump was able to be so populist is that the way that a liberal looks at the finance industry. It's not like this is evil, this is wrong. Like Bernie Sanders says, this is wrong, this is immoral. What's happening is immoral. A liberal or a pragmatic kind of a liberal, let's say, like Hillary Clinton.
A Clintonite, yes.
They're going to look at it and say, you know what? We're going to have the finance industry, whether we like it or not. It's part of our economy. How can we tweak it so that it works better? Whereas a lot of people on the left are like, this whole system is totally flawed and it sucks and it's bad.
What's really interesting is that a lot of people in these sort of white, call it white working, whatever you want to call it, like places like the Midwest, and I can even observe this as a Canadian in this broad region. Like a lot of people, like middle class, working class, actually have a much worse view of financial institutions than they do of, say, like oil companies and like, you know, these corporations that do all these bad things, because they view the corporations more as they view them as like job creators, whereas they view the finance industry, which happens to be largely due to geography pretty close to the Democratic Party, they view them as basically fraudsters. So there is a real, and a lot of people fundamentally don't understand that. They're like, oh, if we expose the Republicans' ties to like these corporations, it'll sink them. Well, no, because a lot of these people hate the financial industry far more than they hate the oil industry.
Well,
And that's just a reality.
Well, a lot of Republicans don't hate the financial industry.
No, exactly. I just mean like you look at like say some independents who are genuine like moderate independents who are caught between the two parties. Like there is potentially some small voter base there that could be swung, but they won't be swung because people by and large don't have a better view of financiers than they do of like, you know, just standard corporations.
Right. Yeah. There is and there's also a little bit of a, you know, a rural versus urban divide, and there can be anti-Semitism in some of that. You know,
there is. Yeah, it's really hard. I actually, you know, they're like, you know, that you're Jewish. I'm not. But there is a lot of talk about like anti-Semitism these days, and I find it really hard to peg what's actually anti-Semitism and what just sort of resembles a dog whistle, but that isn't really influenced by anti-Semitism or isn't anti-Semitism. Because the thing with anti-Semitism is it's so coded in a way that like
it is, yeah.
It's so coded compared to like say like anti-Muslim or, you know, whatever, pick a group, right? And like, so like for example, you could say like, you know, like, you know, anti-Semites like hate the Rothschilds, but then like I know like some people who are like literally just not anti-Semitic in the slightest who are like, oh yeah, I hate the Rothschilds too. They don't think they're manipulating the world, but like they don't like them and like show me this bad stuff they do, and I'm like, okay, they look like shitty people. So I mean, like it is hard to detect this stuff.
Well, a lot of people might say, oh, the Rothschilds are doing this and that, and they don't necessarily know that they're being anti-Semitic, but they are, because they're using anti-Semitic stereotypes and sort of these. You're using the rhetoric of anti-Semitism, and you're being anti-Semitic without doing it intentionally.
Yeah, maybe. Although, like, I mean, I don't think like there's like there's no inherent issue with like pointing out shitty things this really rich family does. But like, you could make a case like they're not really doing that much relative to other people, and it is suspect if like whether you realize it or not, if you're like focusing on them like disproportionately, you know.
No, well, it's this theory.
Yeah.
It's part of this theory that was created by the Russian secret police under the Tsar, that a group of Jewish financial families was controlling the world in this conspiracy. It's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Yeah. Henry Ford helped propagate that book. Didn't he print out like 1 million whatever copies, and he's like, everyone must read this book.
Right, and that theory was part of Nazi propaganda in some ways, and it's continued on. And basically, there's a bank right now, which is a publicly traded corporation, you know, Rothschilds LLC, which is an investment bank. It's based in France, I think, and it's a public corporation. It's like any other investment bank. It's not, you know, and people will say, oh no, the Rothschilds. It's like you're saying, you know, the Bank of America is evil and controlling the world. Well,
like the people I know them referring to, they don't think the Rothschilds control the world. They just think like they think like their position is like, oh yeah, there's all these like you know, funny well, I mean, they're not funny, but they're funny in other ways, like, you know, exaggerated like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but like they actually do crappy things. Like that's basically where a lot of people come down that I've heard on it.
Yeah, but if you're talking, like, nobody's talking about the Walton family.
Yeah, I mean, some of the people I know would, but like, yeah, you're exactly. If there's like disproportionate focus on like this one family, then it's suspect, and like people may not realize it. There's like anti-Semitic roots in what they're saying or thinking, but like there clearly are. You know, like anyone who like obsesses over the Rothschilds is like, yeah, that's pretty sketchy.
No, they're anti-Semitic. I mean, period.
Yeah. Well, they might just not realize. They may have literally no problem with Jews. But they don't realize that like what they think is like influenced by like anti-Semitic propaganda. Like the theoretic, like most of them probably are consciously, but other ones might just be like.
Oh, there's a lot of dumb people out there.
Well, that's what I mean. There's useful. That's what I mean. Like a useful idiot isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. There's like buy into something and they don't really understand the whole context of it.
Right.
So I think
there's intent and there's doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think before. I mean, we've been going at it. I'm happy to keep going. We've been going at this for a little while. I think that we talked about Cory Booker a bit at length. I think that we should talk about, because you're right, it's very hard to predict who's going to win and who's going to do well in a primary. There's a lot of surprises. Nobody thought Bernie Sanders was going to run right after 2012. But like, I think if we talk about like kind of direction the party should go, like I think, like, are there people that because a lot of people say they look at the current Democratic bench and see nothing. Like, do you see, because so much of it comes down to personnel. Really, personnel is like almost everything in politics. Are there like particular rising stars you see, like people worth elevating that can like bring people in or help rebrand? Like, where do you come down on that?
Yeah, there are people who are very impressive and seem like very good politicians on the Democratic side. And they're not all of them are like political, are at the place they're going to be politically what they need to run for president, right? Yeah, and a lot of people, a lot of the kind of conversation where it's like, okay, well, the Democratic mayor of Los Angeles is this young guy, and he's Latino and he's Jewish, and he's done all these media appearances, and so maybe he's a rising star. Maybe he's the next Democratic president. Eric Garcetti. It's like, I don't know anything. I don't know him well enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and they think he's going to win in 2020 or 2024.
He's the mayor. He's not governor. He's not a senator. He doesn't have the platform to do it.
No one knows who he is. He's probably kind of boring, as most mayors are.
And he's never been in a position where he's really being asked to weigh in on the policies that are national level policies. Or like Jason Kanders, another guy. He was someone who he almost won a Senate seat. He's clearly a very good candidate, but he's not anything. He's a private citizen right now. And people look at these things like, well, this guy, he's a young, he's energetic, he was in the military. These are all like good things, right? But you could have the perfect resume to run for president and be totally underwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, like, well, Clinton had, like, I think Obama said in his endorsement, she's probably the most qualified person to speak the audience. She has the best resume of anybody, maybe, who's ever won the Democratic nomination, at least in recent memory.
I mean, in the year 2004, we had this primary, and Democrats were desperate to find somebody who was credible on national security. That was the number one issue was foreign policy.
Yeah, and they picked the Iraq War supporter.
And this guy got into the race named Wes Clark, and people like, he was the former commander of NATO. He was a decorated, war hero, veteran, general, amazing knowledge of all the issues. And then he got into the stump. He started running for president. And people were like, this guy is an idiot. He can't debate. He can't give speeches. He sounds dumb. He sounds slow. He doesn't have the presence of someone who's been a politician and knows how to speak and knows how to enunciate their plans and projects the gravitas of a politician the way that John Kerry did.
Carry on.
Yeah. So, and John Kerry was this guy who, he actually was he's a war hero. So he did have that. But when he was actually able to articulate his views in a much more forceful, compelling way, whereas Wes Clark was a bad speaker, and that mattered a whole lot.
Yeah, and there's a guy who comes to mind. He's somebody who I think. Do you know Pete Buttigieg?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's an extremely impressive individual. Now, he's not a riveting public speaker though. But you look at the guy's resume, and I mean, this is a guy that I think could potentially win on resume alone. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He was like a former former military officer. He's like one of the youngest mayors in America. He's openly gay. I mean, not that should be the number one thing, but like, you know, I mean, this guy he's an extremely impressive individual. I don't know whether he has, you know, whether he can really inspire people, but I mean, he's somebody who I think could definitely seek, like, you know, higher office, you know, than mayor of South Bend. And I also really like him, and he's much more well known. In terms of like senators I really like Chris Murphy a lot. I unfortunately don't see him really having a path to victory in a primary, simply because, like, I don't know if he can really cut out a core constituency, but he's someone I really like. And I think he's been, like, made really good points. You know, he's somebody who, on the Russia issue, which I think in the future is going to be, I think how people handled the Russia issue is going to reflect on them in the future, either positively or negatively. I think he's been very good about it. He hasn't been dismissing it. He's been professional about it, but he's also just been realistic that there's, like, other extremely important prescient things going on. He doesn't get all hysterical about it. I think he has a lot of good policy positions. I think on foreign policy, he's really good. He, with Rand Paul, he led that unfortunately botched attempt because of a few, like, you know, Republicans and Democratic assholes who voted against it, attempt to block the Saudi arms deal. Like, I really like that guy. Unfortunately, I just can't see him winning a primary, though, at least not in this environment and at this time.
Well, you really don't know. And it depends who runs. And to me, like, deciding who's a good candidate before they start running and they start talking and giving, I think they should have 20 people run.
I want it to be like a competitive, like, big battle of ideas, as Dave Rubin would call it. Like, I actually want the Democratic primary to be, like, much more competitive than it was in 2016, where you had, like, two real candidates.
They should make everyone run. And then make it like a reality show where you vote everyone off on the first day and then just working through it. No, I think maybe the best way to do it is you have the most competition possible, and you have a debate. You have, like, those kitchen table where, you know, we have the kids table debate. Yeah. They should have like a round robin. There should be like a tournament. Like, you have to win your first round debate to get into the second round debate. You know, stuff like that. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think we both know. I mean, it's a funny idea. I think we both know some of the issues with that, but yeah, I'm looking forward to the prime. I think it will be a big field. I think that's a good thing. You know,
I mean, there's the one person I will support is Al Franken if he runs. That's my one.
Al Franken. Yeah, I think he could be a good candidate. I think people like him. He's not a divisive figure.
Yeah. So if Al Franken runs, I'm signed up. I'm Team Franken if he runs. Yeah. But aside from that, I'm totally. I won't make up my mind until I clearly see some candidate who's good.
There's somebody who has grown on me significantly since I first heard her name, and I wonder if you already know who this is. I don't think you're a particularly big fan of her. Yeah, you know, I originally, when I first heard about Tulsi Gabbard, it was, all this. No, I do. I've come to quite like her, actually. I think she's actually gotten a bad rap from certain people. Like, when you actually think about, okay, so, like, she mostly gets bad rap because of the whole Syria Assad thing, right? Well, when you look at the policy she's pushing, which is her bill to Stop Arming Terrorists Act, it's the right policy. Like, it's a policy that a lot of Democrats actually support. And I mean, she went to Syria, like, ostensibly, to help promote the policy she's trying to push as a lawmaker. And she ended up meeting with Assad. I'm not thrilled about that. And she has made some kind of, like, soft she hasn't praised him, but she's made some, like, soft apologetics. When you compare, I think that there's a double standard being applied to her, though, because think about, like, how so many, because they want certain policies passed, think about, like, all the apologetics, like, politicians make all the time for bad foreign governments. Like, they do it constantly. Like, they do it for, Saudi Arabia, which is doing horrible things in Yemen that the U.S. is directly supporting. And they do it for, like, I'm not, like, a big Israel hater, but, like, it's just very common. Like, a lot of people sanitize bad stuff Israel might do. Like, you could pick a country.
Yeah.
People do it all the time. Like, I don't get why she, like, okay, like, yeah, she's doing some, like, mild apologetics. She hasn't praised the guy. She admits he's bad. But, like, think about it. Like, most people, she probably knows when she's speaking to people. Most people don't really get the nuances. Like most people will have a hard time wrapping their head around this guy is bad. Maybe he should be removed at some point in the future, but we shouldn't be arming these people. Like most who are fighting him. Most people won't really see that. So like you can't like you'll be sending very mixed messages. You won't really be promoting your thing effectively if you're out there like bashing this guy like crazy, then also being like, oh yeah, and I also think we should not arm the people fighting him. Like it's just incoherent that way. So I get as a lawmaker what she was doing there. And I think she was pushing a policy that was good. I'm not a fan of Assad. I'm not an apologist for him at all. Just to be remotely clear, terrible person.
Well,
but I think that she's been unfairly treated, and there's like a double standard there that's being applied to her.
Well, I think I want to wrap up pretty soon, but I have to. We have to finish Tulsi Gabbard as a topic.
Okay, sure, because she's a very controversial figure, but I think it's an interesting conversation around her.
Okay, well, I think she's somebody who has no integrity. I think her policies are she's like one of the most just transparent, just lying like politicians you come out there. So she begins her political career, right? And she's part of her father's political like cult.
Yeah, she's got a very conservative Hindu. No, he's not Hindu, is he? No,
he's a Hare Krishna. He's a Hare Krishna.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Her mom's a Hindu, I think.
Yeah. Her father was part of like a Hare Krishna splinter cult that was one of their things was being incredibly homophobic. So she was out there. She wasn't just against gay marriage, which everyone back in the day was against gay marriage. I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah.
But when Bill Clinton was against gay marriage, he was also the foremost gay rights politician to ever be elected president, and he was really close to the gay community, and it wasn't similar. Tulsi Gabbard was an anti-gay politician. One of her big issues was talking about the gay agenda, the rabid homosexual agenda in Hawaii. So if you're an anti-gay activist as part of your political views, to me, that really doesn't speak very highly of you. I understand if you decided to be against gay marriage for political reasons. I get that because it wasn't popular at one point.
Again, like I'll put that, like, you have to take into account though, like her age at the time and her upbringing. Like,
no, but this was when she was in her 30s and she was in political office.
She's in her 30s now. She supported gay marriage thing since 2012. So like she would have been in her 20s at this time. Like,
but she was a state representative. She was like 29 or something like that. So
all right, yeah. So she was like,
and then she got to Congress in 2012, right? And her first 2 or 3 years in Congress, she was a moderate Democrat. She was a blue dog Democrat in her voting record.
I looked at her record, and people always say that, but I don't really see how. Like, it just seems like on every issue that I could find, even ones where people would say like she voted. I look it up and it would say like she voted the other way. Like she doesn't, like, she seems to be a lot less moderate than a lot of Democrats are. Like she seems fairly liberal.
You take all the Democrats in the House caucus and you rank them from 1 being most conservative to 100 being most Democrat.
Sure.
The first to the 100th percentile. She's in the 20th percentile. And her district is a solid, safe blue district.
She's not a blue dog then. If she's in the 20th, she's just sort of a standard Democrat.
No, she's conservative. So if 1 is conservative, 100 is super left. She's in the 20th percentile.
For a Democrat.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I don't know. Her on the issues. So has her as like a liberal left on the issues. I don't know.
So if you look at her voting record, was a moderate Democrat. So she wasn't the most moderate, but she was in the top quartile of most conservative. And her district was a safe blue district. So she didn't have to vote moderate, but she did vote moderate.
Yeah, but she does have, maybe there's like kind of smaller things on which, and that actually get voted on more, where she's maybe been more moderate. Because remember, often like people are just party line, and like 1 or 2 votes out can like kind of skew you differently. But a lot of her major policies, like I gotta say, on the most important issue to me, the environment, she's fantastic on environmental. She always has been, even when her dad was like, even when she was like a social conservative, she was fantastic on environmental issues. And
but
on healthcare, she's really good on healthcare. She's pretty tough on financial regulation. She's pretty tough on the financial stuff. I personally just don't know enough about, honestly, those issues.
She actually voted to make Dodd-Frank weaker. So
wait, did she?
Yeah, she voted to make Dodd-Frank weaker. And
I think I saw you tweet that, and I looked it up, and I couldn't really find any. When was that?
This was, I don't remember the exact date of the vote, but if you look up her score on Americans for Democratic Action, or you can see, well, she's not. There's a voting record for every single year, and they score Democrats, and she does not come out very well on that. But
because I'm just looking it up, I remember looking it up, but I could just find her being against weakening Dodd-Frank. I couldn't find.
Well, yeah. But here's the thing: she's become more left wing in the last since she endorsed Bernie Sanders. So if you're politically willing to sort of bend in the wind on a dime and change your political views, I don't trust you. It's
dude, you're a huge Clinton supporter though, man.
She didn't do that. She never did that. No, she never did that.
She's changed her stance. In the 90s, she wasn't exactly, the woke girl she was trying to be in 2060. Come on, man, you know that.
Okay, there's a difference between moderating yourself to win and
dude, she did support Barry Goldwater too. I mean, when she was probably a similar
age to Tulsi.
I know. I'm saying Tulsi Gabbard's not very old though. When she was into the anti-gay stuff, she wasn't that old. I mean,
she was in the state legislature. I mean, come on.
It's too old. I don't like that about her. It's a mixed bag. Every politician is a mixed bag. That's just the way I see it.
Here's the thing.
Every politician's a mixed bag.
She's a spokesperson for Modi, Indian nationalism.
He's the Indian. No, he's the Indian prime minister.
Right.
Correct.
She's a big proponent of Modi. In
that case though, Obama never had Obama wasn't anti-Modi. She was more or less following U.S. foreign policy under Obama by being pro-Modi.
No. She
wasn't.
No, I think she is somebody who speaks out in favor of these Indian nationalist causes, and that is part of the reason that she's talked about Islamic. She attacked Obama for not calling
I actually agree with that. I'm a Sam Harris fan, so I mean I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, but she's not saying that because she's saying that because she's an Indian nationalist, and she's a Hindu nationalist, so she's going to take a stand.
She's also Modi. Is she actually a Hindu nationalist? Is that kind of extrapolating from her? I would say praising Modi, because I mean, a lot of people praise bad people,
Okay, but her political leanings are towards supporting Russia, supporting Modi, supporting these forces that are,
How does she support Russia? She's voted for all the sanctions U.S. has put on Russia. She's pro-Assad in the Syrian conflict, but she's not pro-Russia. And here, that's one specific area. She's voted for all the sanctions on them.
Right, but
even when I was against the most recent wave of sanctions on those three countries, she still voted for them. I'm actually glad Bernie Sanders voted against it. She's not a Russia dove, I mean, which is how she's sometimes painted. But I mean, on the Modi thing,
she downplays what Russia does in Syria, and she is she's running a political game against the United States in favor of Assad and the interests of India politically.
How is Assad necessarily against the United States? Because the U.S. is backing kind of anti-Assad forces.
Okay, the United States.
Realistically, that was never really a serious attempt to overthrow Assad. That was mostly geopolitical virtue signaling. It was a ridiculous program from the start.
Okay, but there aren't a lot of politicians who go out and praise or go out and defend. She actually said that it's possible that Assad did not use chemical weapons, right?
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I don't like the like. I guess very
So,
early on it was more up in the air, but at this point,
the apologism for countries that are that are against America, against American interests, and are not allied with the United States.
But I mean, what's in it? Well, I mean, Syria's not like they were sort of allied with the United, like Western countries actually liked Assad a little while, like unless like hardcore neocons wanted Assad gone in 2006, but America, what like there was never like an American ally, but
Right.
like there were Americans that thought like, oh, you know, this Assad guy, he's a Western trained doctor, he's maybe a bit of a reformer, like it's not like he's not like a hard enemy of the U.S. He's a bad guy that's done bad things. But in my book, it doesn't make you anti-America to oppose arming, like one, fueling a conflict. You know, the longer the war is on, the more people die by arming these groups, and also risking like these arms getting in the hands of other groups that are aligned with them that are absolutely horrible, like Al-Nusra and the Islamic Front, who they have like traded arms with and fight alongside.
Right,
like it was a really stupid policy from the start, and so I don't see it as anti-America for her to be trying to sell a bill to stop this. And I understand the apologetics are bad, and I don't like it. But a lot of politicians do that for a lot of countries when they're trying to sell a policy. It sucks, but they do that.
Yeah, but those countries are usually allied with the United States. They're not being, they're not committing genocide and enemies of the United States.
Well, Assad's not committing genocide. He's fighting it's a police state at war, and it's ugly, but it's not a genocide.
Well, he's committing massive humanitarian violations and atrocities.
Yeah, okay. That's true. But his opponents aren't great either. If they had Air Force,
but I think she's willing to lie in favor of her position. She's willing to misstate what Assad is doing. She's willing
maybe not lie, but she's willing to kind of like dance around. But I mean, I'm saying that's really common.
I think she's also misstated what the United States has done in terms of supporting what Islamic rebel groups. I think a lot of her statements have been misleading and disingenuous. And
it kind of depends on how you look at them. It's a little complicated. Like first of all, the group that they are funding, they were funding, Trump stopped it, which is one of the few things he's done I agree with. Was the Southern Front, and the Southern Front, they're the most moderate wing of the rebels. And the rebels I separate from the Kurds because the rebels are actually against the Kurds. Another reason I'm against supporting them. They're the most moderate faction, but even it's kind of ambiguous really who or what they are. They have more extreme factions within that. But then when you look at who they're fighting alongside, who they're effectively supporting, you look at the opposition. The opposition is overwhelmingly jihadists who have explicitly genocide. Like I read some of the stuff and I'm like, yikes, it made me change my position on Syria. These are like genocidal groups.
Okay, well,
that would be empowered when the other rebels are empowered because they fight together, and the rebels have actually given them arms and stuff because we don't really control what happens with the arms after they're in the hands of the slightly more moderate ones. Directly or indirectly, you're supporting these groups.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't have a strong position on what our policy in Syria should be because I don't think there's any good answers as far as I'm concerned. I can't figure it out. But the thing is with Gabbard, the fact that she's willing to sort of spout propaganda and lies that are
I wouldn't quite say propaganda. There's some spin. There's political spin, but I'm just saying spin is really common. Like look at Saudi Arabia. You get spin all the time from politicians about that. And to her credit, she opposes what they're doing in Yemen. That's great. I mean that to me counterbalances she's opposed that from like the start. And for me, that counterbalances any apologetics for Syria. Like I look at this stuff as a whole and as like an equation overall and like what it works, what the balance is. And she has a pretty good balance when it comes to foreign policy. Like you know what I'm trying. You get what I'm trying to say on this point?
I mean, to me, I think she's very disingenuous and she acts in bad faith. And I think she's someone who I don't trust her. I think she's, I don't trust her integrity as a politician. And the fact that she's, has all these different allegiances, the fact that she's willing to lie, the fact that she met with Assad, the fact that she, sort of openly sort of, said that, doubted our intelligence estimates of all that sort of stuff, like in a very, I'd say, flagrantly, concern trolly, not really accurate way.
Well, she did say we should be. Well, she did actually have a point on that when she said, the UN investigation actually wasn't finished when Trump did the strike. I supported the strike, by the way, but I mean, she did have a point there, but whatever. Like,
and I mean, there are certain politicians where I just, they haven't done enough to, like, they break faith too many times.
well, I disagree with that though, because she actually is pretty good at getting stuff passed. Like, I follow her a bit on social media, and like there are often like bills she introduces and co-sponsors that are actually get pretty good bipartisan support on a lot of important issues, like really important things like human trafficking and like domestic violence and veterans issues. And these are all very important things. And like I think that I think there has been a bit of a stir whipped up about her. And I think there are some like things that she does that are more under the radar that I think are very admirable. Like, I try to look at it overall, and you know what? I don't like her anti-gay stance at all. I've never in my life been against gay marriage, and I don't like that even remotely. But I have to look on balance. I think she's really good on a lot of issues, and I think that's just where I come out here.
Okay, but
I don't think we're going to agree, but like, that's just.
I would rather have somebody who was anti-war in terms of their stance, like Senator Murphy.
Chris Murphy, yeah, I like Chris Murphy for a lot of the reasons I like Tulsi Gabbard, and I like him more. For example,
right, but
him over Gabbard. I'm just saying, I think she gets a bad.
I'd rather have somebody who was anti-war than somebody who was taking sides, like, ideologically, in service of an ideology, like, being in favor of Modi and wanting to align with the United States.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know enough about the India Modi thing. Like, obviously there is. I mean, she was a Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, a Hindu, and she was broadly speaking sort of supporting Obama's policy, which was to be a bit friendlier with him. Like, so I mean, and that I don't really know where to splice that. I don't know enough about him. Like, there's clearly an interest in the United States having a good relationship with India. It's a huge country. We need to work with them on, like, they're important in like climate change and some security issues, like and economic stuff. Like, there's a clear interest there. It's a big power player. It's not a country you can just totally give the cold shoulder and that's not something Obama did. And I mean, her position as a Hindu Democrat potentially does lend itself to having that kind of foreign policy that Obama wanted, that he got a lot of criticism for, that from some people. But I mean, other people just thought, a lot of people, it does go back to, like, I think that people get mad at her for stuff that they don't get mad at other people for. Like this whole thing that's going on in Yemen, that like Obama supported to his credit, to a lesser degree than Trump, and like a lot of Democrats supported. That's absolutely horrible. That's worse than what Assad is doing in Syria. And yet, like, they don't get much flack for that whatsoever. Okay, but and at least Gabbard's against that. To Murphy's credit, he's more against it than her.
If the United States is like cozying up to al-Sisi and Modi and these dictators near the Arab world who are their policy is to crack down on what is radical Islam, and she seems to have I would say an anti-Muslim sort of core to her foreign policy, right?
It's a little no, I wouldn't necessarily say that, because when you look at a lot of these conflicts, it is Muslims on both sides. Like, I mean,
no, but
Alawites are Muslims, and they'd be in major risk if the rebels won in Syria. So I don't think it's anti-Muslim.
I think it shares a ideology with the BJP, the Modi sort of view of things.
It might. It's just hard to splice that though, because in India it is more clear cut, like Hindu against Muslim as a block, whereas in all these Middle Eastern places, it's Sunni and Shia on either side, both of which are Muslim. Like,
right.
And in Syria, the government it's relatively secular. It's more, right. It's even more secular than Saddam. So, but I mean, you can look into it's secular, but it is playing a role. And part of this is manufactured by Assad because he wanted to have this leverage. But they are undeniably protecting a lot of people in the government-controlled area. They're not protecting them like, my government protects me in Canada, but they're protecting them from some really horrible groups. So there is legitimacy to that. And I don't think it breaks down as like pro-Muslim, anti-Muslim. Like, there's some people with a really uninformed, ignorant view of this that think that's what it is, but it's really not what, if you like go into it in much detail. At least in Syria, for example, and in Yemen, it's clearly, that's just like there's no pro-Muslim, anti-Muslim side in Yemen. That's like Muslims of all stripes, especially Shias, but in all stripes, being like they're at this point they're being starved to death. It's like a modern day Holodomor. It's unbelievable.
Right.
So I mean, I get maybe with the India, like I don't know, like
and she's voted against like measure like resolutions that say that criticizing the religious state of religious freedom in India. She's had joint meetings with BJP leaders in the United States. And
well, I can the meetings to me make sense because of her role as like basically supporting the president's policy in that particular case as like a Hindu Democrat. She's like the only Hindu in Congress. I actually understand that.
Well, I understand her being a liaison, but what she's doing is that she's creating this sort of foreign policy view that is undercutting what Obama was doing as president in a very sort of like aggressive way, giving ammunition to Republicans. And then,
a lot of the criticism is pretty valid. Like the rebel policy in Syria was stupid. The Yemen thing is horrific. Like that should transcend partisanship. And to be clear, like these things are bipartisan, right? Like these are things Republicans all support. All these bad things. Like she's cutting against Obama, but she's cutting against just bad things that both parties do and are supporting.
Well,
just because Obama happens to be president, like Trump was doing both of those things until recently, still doing the Saudi thing, except in a more extreme fashion.
Right. So, I mean, I guess my view of her is that she's not on the side of Democrats. She's very willing to, sort of.
She's very nonpartisan. That could actually lend her. That could actually be kind of a good thing.
Richard Spencer's a big fan of her.
He's a fan of her because they happen to agree on Syria. Like realistically, like I don't think he'd agree with like her, like other policies and like feminism. Like he probably I think he'd take issue with like all the other stuff.
But he's someone who's praised her. So I guess. My view is that I don't trust her foreign policy as a coherent thing, and the fact that was a blue dog Democrat who came out and supported Bernie Sanders as well,
that seemed to be because of foreign policy and maybe some other issues like environment, healthcare, financial regulation.
I don't believe
on some of that.
I don't believe that. I think it was all foreign policy, and I think that sort of crusade that she's on, in terms of meeting with Trump and sort of allowing herself to be sort of talked about as a potential Trump appointee. And I don't think she's sufficiently,
Well, one thing I didn't like was that she didn't. Speaking of just like the Trump stuff, like I'm not one of those people who claims that like she's like a voter for Trump. I don't think that's true. Like as a lawmaker, like she obviously would have favored Hillary Clinton, who would have been more likely to sign things she would have tried to pass. But like, what I don't like is that I don't think she did enough to like endorse Clinton and like campaign for her and whatnot after Sanders lost. She basically just said, "I'm going to vote for Clinton," and that was basically the end of it. I think she should have pushed much harder for Clinton, but she didn't. And I think that's a real thing to criticize her for, because now we have Trump, which sucks.
No, I think politicians need to have some sort of party loyalty in my view. And
I mean, like, I have no doubt she voted for Clinton and she did endorse her, but like, it's she is a pretty on most issues she's pretty stalwart. Like I think it's just though if your president is doing bad, stupid things in foreign policy and opposing that. Like, how is that? Like, that's like the worst kind of party loyalty if you're going to toe the line in extremely consequential instances that actually involve like human life and suffering. Like, to toe the line just for the sake of following your president's foreign policy. Like we wouldn't want like Rand Paul to. If Rand Paul doesn't do that with Trump, and we wouldn't want him to with Trump, given all the awful things Trump's doing. Like, I think it's admirable to a degree, so long as you're not going to like endorse the other candidate, so long as you are mostly supporting the sensible legislation your side is. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's good in some respects, in a lot of respects. I think actually. Now again, she's not perfect. I've conceded your points, but like the gay marriage thing. I mean, she was basically she was like from a very indoctrinated by a very conservative. I don't like that stuff. I don't like stuff.
I get attacked for being a centrist Democrat, and she's way to my right on policy.
Is she? although like again though, like in certain
She-
stuff though, like environment and healthcare, financial regulation, war and stuff, she's clearly on the left.
Well, I look at her total voting record, and she's been willing to sort of be a chameleon about that in a way.
I'll need to look into it because I actually was looking into her on the, and she looked like a pretty standard Democrat to me. There wasn't
Anyhow.
anything. There was okay, yeah, but we've been talking for quite a while.
All right. Well, I'm gonna call it
Yeah.
end to this. Good talking to you, man.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed this conversation a lot. Yeah, hopefully we can maybe do it again sometime.
All
Yeah,
right.
it was great. Okay.
All right. Adios.
Adios.